Julie didn't understand what Carlos meant at first, but soon she remembered what had happened in the kitchen the day before. Did Debbie really take the meal to Mr. Huo's office? Why is he asking about the dinner? Was he displeased by it? She wondered pensively. Afraid of the possibility that Carlos was angry at Debbie, Julie replied at once. Mr. Huo, to make sure that the dishes tasted good, Debbie cooked every dish several times. She even suffered a few minor burns because of the hot, boiling oil. Julie felt that even though the dishes tasted awful, Debbie had worked hard on them. It was her good intentions that counted. Got burnt? Was her apology sincere? The anger in his eyes disappeared as soon as he heard Julie's words. Noted. Carlos nodded and started eating his breakfast. The stress marks on his face softened. Julie breathed out a sigh of relief and headed back to the kitchen. After lunch, Debbie got dressed and left the villa. Debbie, Casey, and Christina wandered around to pick out a present for Carlos. They walked out of Dubhe Building and went straight to Merak Building, arm in arm. Tomboy, what exactly do you have in mind? They had been to a few shops for fashionable men's wear, trendy shoes, and expensive watches, but nothing piqued Debbie's interest. If she kept wandering around, refusing to buy anything, Christina would start suspecting that Debbie was wandering around for hot guys instead of a present. In fact, the real problem was money. Debbie had been saving up, but her savings were far from enough to afford a decent present for Carlos. Let's look a little longer, she said. Casey leaned on Christina listlessly, rolling her eyes. Debbie, my sweet, sweet Debbie. We have been wandering around for 2 hours now, and you haven't bought anything. All the while, she and Christina, on the other hand, carried a couple of bags each. Some were clothes, but the rest were mostly cosmetics. He is so rich, he doesn't need anything. What am I supposed to buy him? Debbie was in a dilemma. Is it his birthday? Christina asked. Debbie had told them she was shopping for a present for a friend, but they knew she was hiding something from them. Nope, Debbie answered. Christina rolled her eyes at her. Since it's not his birthday, why do you suddenly want to give him a present? Debbie returned her a stare, but she wasn't going to answer her question. She was too embarrassed to tell them that the present was for Carlos, and it was an apologetic present for offending him earlier. Spit it out. The other girls demanded and stretched their arms towards her to give her the bags. Debbie took the bags sullenly. Casey instantly felt as though a huge weight had been lifted off her, and she felt much happier because of it. Debbie, seriously, it doesn't matter how much the present is worth. It is the thought that counts, she remarked. Debbie considered it for a moment and replied, That sounds about right. I know what I should get him now. She handed the bags back to her friends and started walking back. Hey, Debbie, what kind of friend are you? Christina yelled as she ran after her angrily. While the two girls walked farther and farther away, Casey lowered her head with disappointment. Although she was very tired, she quickened her pace and followed them since she didn't want to be left behind. Debbie remembered an embroidered box she had spotted lying in a showcase earlier, the contents of which had caught her attention. Before long, she walked back into the store that sold suits. Welcome to Enjoy, the shop assistant greeted warmly as soon as the customers stepped in. Debbie smiled at her and pointed at the embroidered box in the showcase. I'd like to have a look at that one, please. The woman fetched the box without hesitation and handed it to Debbie. There is a brooch and a collar pin inside this box. Both are made of sapphire. Miss, are you looking for a present for your boyfriend? You have keen eyes. Every item in the box is uniquely designed and specially made to order. When she heard the word sapphire, Debbie's eyes went straight towards the price tag. $188,000. Her entire savings were just less than $200,000. Debbie was hesitant. She thought about it for a long time before she finally pressed her lips and made up her mind. However, Just as she was looking around to search for the shop assistant, she heard a familiar voice from behind her. Wrap up the accessories I just looked at. Jailmu, son of a gun. Debbie felt as if she had found a dead fly in her soup. She ignored Gail and turned around to walk towards the cashier's desk with the embroidered box in her hand. Much to her surprise, the shop assistant stopped her in her tracks. I'm sorry, miss, but the other lady has already agreed to purchase this, she said to Debbie apologetically. What? Jailmu wants the same thing as me? Since when does she have such good taste? Debbie mused, annoyed. Gail noticed the embroidered box in Debbie's hand. Having just realized what had happened, she sneered and said, Debbie, luck is not on your side today. I saw that box first. In truth, Gail had no intentions of spending money on the items in the store, but now that she had the chance to snatch something from Debbie, the price didn't matter at all. Just at that moment, Casey and Christina arrived at the scene. As soon as they saw Debbie, they started complaining. Tomboy, why did you run so fast? The present wasn't going to fly away, Casey said, as she gasped for air. That's right. Look, my fingers are all red from carrying these bags. And you didn't even help me. Christina held out her hands in front of Debbie for her to look. Debbie ignored her friends and focused on Gail instead. I saw it too, and I like it. Ask the shop assistant to bring you another one. Only then did Casey and Christina notice Gail, who was a self-proclaimed it girl at school. Finding herself in an awkward predicament, the shop assistant felt embarrassed. I'm sorry, ladies. All our products are limited editions. This is the only set that's available. All their products were exquisite. Apart from the shirts, which they had doubles of in their inventory, all other products were single items. Upon hearing the ship assistant's word, Debbie said nothing and went straight to the cashier's desk. Be quick, she said to the cashier, handing her the bank card. Gail rushed towards the cashier's desk and put her hand on the box. Debbie, I swear it first. Why don't you just pick another one? She spoke in a fake coy voice, but her eyes were staring at Debbie resentfully. Christina felt goosebumps all over her body. Hey Gail, can't you just speak normally? I've got goosebumps here, she shouted. Elevating stories, elevating minds. The other shop assistants all began laughing at Kristen's joke. Gail casts her a fiery glare. Christina, this is none of your business. Keep your nose out of this, she retorted. Christina curled up her lips and turned her head away. Not only was Gail a self-proclaimed a girl, she was also a snitch. Christina never took a fancy to talking with her, so she sat down to rest and didn't want to say another word to Gail. Debbie slapped Gail's hand away and pushed her aside. Why didn't you buy it earlier? Now I have my eyes on it, she declared unequivocally. Gail was alone, while on her opposing side, there were three of them. Needless to say, the situation was not to her advantage. Gritting her teeth furiously, she took out her phone and called her boyfriend. After all, the mall was his turf. Victor, please come to enjoy suit shop on the 3rd floor. Someone is bullying me, she urged coyly, with an extremely soft voice, which made Debbie cringe. It was a wonder how Gail managed to turn into such an innocent, weak girl in an instant. Hump, calling backup? No big deal. I don't give a darn, Debbie thought to herself. Settle the account, Debbie demanded and glared at the cashier with an intense look on her face. However, the cashier was still hesitant. The name Victor rang a bell. She had heard it before. Was he the vice general manager of the mall? She wasn't sure about it. But if he was who she thought he was, how could she afford to offend him? When the cashier hesitated to take her card, Debbie lost her patience and snapped, "Didn't you hear me? I said, take my card and give me the receipt." The truth was, she felt bad that she had to direct her anger at the cashier, as she knew why the woman behind the counter was unwilling to do her job. She must have known whom Gail had called. "Miss, I'm sorry, but could you please wait a minute? That lady." She seemed to have called the vice general manager of our mall. The cashier explained while looking back and forth between Debbie and Gail. She had no idea what was happening. All she knew was that she wanted to offend neither of the customers. "Huh? The vice general manager of Shining International Plaza? What's the big deal?" "My husband is the owner," she retorted in private. She walked towards Gail with an irritated expression and said in a sarcastic tone, "How many times have you been to the dean's office? Did you think I was stupid? I know you were the one who snitched on me. If I could, I would tear that mask off your face, but I'm simply too busy to be bothered right now. We both know that does not mean I'm afraid of you. Fortunately for you, I had been in no mood to have open disputes with you regarding the matter, even though you kept stabbing me in the back. You won the last time. But if you think carrying on with that attitude is going to keep giving me losses, then you better get ready. I'm warning you, Gail Moo. If you dare provoke me one more time, I'll make sure you're on the losing end." Gail turned pale upon hearing Debbie's threats. She knew that the feisty girl before her was not afraid of her at all. If she had to be taken down, she would be. She shuddered at the thought that she was arguing with someone who was not afraid of anyone. "What kind of nonsense are you spewing now? I didn't tell the dean anything," Gail denied, hoping to escape Debbie's wrath. That was her strategy. She would refuse any accusations against her, knowing full well that Debbie had no concrete proof that she was the one who had told on her. However, the nervous look on her face had already given her away. Her voice had begun to tremble whenever she would try to explain herself. Debbie, who was already expecting Gail's reaction, flashed a mocking smile and silently cursed the bitch. "For the sake of your parents, I will not be beating you up today. Instead, for the last time, I'm going to tell you that this collar pin is mine, so you better choose another one. Otherwise, you know you'll be walking out of here limp," Debbie warned her. She had her arms crossed before her chest, projecting a demeanor and gesture of someone who was fearless. Christina and Casey giggled behind Debbie because they knew that their friend was just bluffing. Debbie could be a little tetchy, but she had a tender heart. Debbie would not really beat Gail up because the girl going against her was her aunt's daughter. They were in fact cousins by blood, so she was actually quite tolerant of her cousin. Even after what Gail had done to Debbie, the latter had still begged Carlos not to get her cousin expelled. However, Gail did not share the same sentiment as her relative. She got pissed off and yelled, "Who do you think you are? Don't think that I don't know your dirty little secret. The BMW you're riding? It must be from your sugar daddy. Huh? The guy must be old. I don't think the collar pin will suit him." She made her voice louder than ever on purpose so that everyone could hear what she was on about. Rumor had it that Debbie had a sugar daddy, and almost all the students in the university believed it to be true. Gail believed that only a successful businessman like her boyfriend deserved that pin they were arguing to purchase, and she would, by no means, give it up to Debbie. The people surrounding them all turned to look at Debbie with judgmental and condemning eyes. When Debbie noticed that everyone around her had chosen to trust her spoiled cousin's statement, she heavily banged her palm on the counter, making a thump loud enough to silence the people chattering and murmuring about her. All of a sudden, Casey rushed towards the rumor-mongering girl. She was fuming when she said through gritted teeth, "Do you think I don't know what you've done to Debbie behind her back? How dare you make up stories to frame her? Are you appealing to death? Apologize to Debbie now." The girl before the enraged friend knew what Casey was talking about. She had made up a story that Debbie was a lesbian. She was backed up in a corner and did not know what to do. Luckily for her, a man in a black suit and leather shoes entered the shop. He was in his 30s and he looked very frail as he was thin as a stick. Nevertheless, he was Gail's savior. Who is this guy? How is he related to Gale? The trio thought to themselves in wonder. Gale's eyes lit up when she saw the man. She gave him a pitiful look before throwing herself into his arms. Victor, you're finally here. I was scared to death. Scared to death? By me? Am I a rabid animal? It's not like I really came after her, Debbie thought. The fierce girl rolled her eyes. The man, Victor Liu, patted his girl's back and consoled her for a while. He then walked towards the salesladies. Who bullied my girlfriend? He asked in a stern voice. The salesladies, who were afraid of both parties, shook their heads immediately, pretending not to know in order to not get involved. When the trio realized that the man who had stood up for Gale was her boyfriend, they exchanged glances in shock and disbelief, for the man Gale was with was at least 10 years older than her. Debbie covered her face, feeling embarrassed for her cousin. She did not expect her to be so shameless to the point of finding herself a sugar daddy. Her heart ached for her aunt and uncle. Had they known about this, their hearts would break. She lost all will and drive to argue. All she could set her mind on now was telling her aunt about what she had found out when she met her next time. All she had to do now was pay the bill. She turned to the cashier and once again demanded that her item be packed for purchase. However, the cashier still remained silent and refused Debbie's card. The man was the vice general of the mall, after all. She did not want to risk losing her job over such a petty quarrel. Victor, I saw the pin first and wanted to buy it for you as a birthday gift. But by the time I had gotten out of the lady's room, she already had it in possession. Gale pointed to her cousin and pouted her mouth. Victor Liu was elated at Gale's words as he loved the expensive gift. Debbie cursed her own cousin inside her mind. Fuck you, Jail Moo. Shame on you for being such a big liar. I saw it first. Besides, if you were the first one to see it, then why didn't you buy it in the first place? Admit it. You just want to mess with me, the fuming girl said. It was not until then that Debbie caught the attention of Victor Liu. His eyes lit up when he saw her pretty face. A dirty smile began to form on his face. Damn it! If I had seen her first, then I wouldn't have addressed Gale as my girlfriend. He thought to himself. Miss, could you please let my girlfriend have the item? I will find you another nice pin. What do you think of it? The man bargained while looking at Debbie from head to toe. He had never seen anyone so pure, and being a creep, he thought, she must be a virgin. Upon seeing how disgusting the man was when he looked at her, Debbie almost threw up and turned his offer down without any hesitation. No, I only want this one. No one in here can force me to give it up, Debbie clarified. Unravel the unknown. Unleash the unimaginable. The two parties had run into a dead end. Victor Liu found that Gale was tearing up and then turned to Debbie to beg her, Miss? Before he could even finish his sentence, Debbie interrupted and exclaimed, Pack that for me or I'll sue the shit out of you in this store. She gave the cashier a deadly glare which caused the woman to finally reach out to take her card. Victor Liu had gone red from the anger caused by being disrespected by the young girl. Don't sell it to her. I'm the vice general manager of the mall and you do as I say. While what he said was true, he never really got to the top of his position without his father's funding. Shining International Plaza was under the ZL Group, and he had done well. Thus, his father had spent a lot of money to make him the vice general manager of the mall. Debbie gave the man a scornful gaze and mocked him. Vice general manager? So what? You think I'm buying it? My husband is the CEO of the ZL Group. Have I ever shown off like that? The ferocious girl retorted inwardly. Victor Louis was absolutely livid about it and turned to the cashier demanding, Pack the item for my girlfriend. She is going to take it. And do your job. Let her pay the bill. What the fuck? Is Gale really his girlfriend? He doesn't even pay for her expenses. Casey thought as she crossed her arms and rolled her eyes. Yes, Mr. Liu. The cashier obeyed. She then set aside Debbie's card and turned to Gail's direction. Gail immediately took out her wallet to pay for the collar pin and the brooch. But before she could do that, Debbie was already mad to the point that there was no turning back anymore. She snatched her cousin's wallet and threw it outside the store. Gail looked at her cousin in utter disbelief. "Bitch, what did you just do? Why did you do that?" exclaimed the enraged girl. The wallet, which contained fortunes, attracted so much attention that a crowd began to form around it. "Are you seriously asking me why I threw your wallet out? You obviously wanted to snatch the collar pin that I wanted to buy. I've already had enough of your dirty little tricks. If you ever dare mess with me again, I swear you will get more than this. I'll definitely beat you up," Debbie said, shouting so loudly that her voice grabbed the attention of many mall-goers. After saying this, she shook her fist that made Gail's face turn pale. Intimidated by her, she dodged Debbie's eyes and ran out to pick up her wallet. When Victor saw his girlfriend getting bullied, he pointed to Debbie and threatened in a harsh voice, "If you dare bully my baby again, I will ask the guards to throw you out of the mall." Gail looked like a little girl helplessly picking up her wallet in front of the crowd. Despite hearing his threat, Debbie only rolled her eyes and said in a nonchalant tone, "Help yourself. Go ahead and do whatever you like." She had never been a pushover. She wasn't afraid of anyone in this world. This attitude of hers made her able to walk through life as brave as she could despite everything she'd been through. But wait, out of all the people, there was one man she wouldn't dare to offend, Carlos. In the midst of her fierce stance, his face suddenly popped up in her mind. "You want to threaten me? Okay, just bring Carlos here, and then I'll do as you say," she thought to herself. After some time, the crowd started to build up. Some mall-goers were already talking about the commotion that was happening, pointing to the store where Debbie was. Upon seeing Gail's wallet flying out of the store, many were surprised. How could the security of a prestigious mall allow such a commotion to happen? And that very moment the wallet flew out, coincidentally, Carlos was there. Judging from the flying track of the wallet, he could easily tell that it was thrown out on purpose. He then saw a girl with red eyes, trying to stop her tears, running towards the wallet and picked it up. Surprised, the general manager of the mall, who was standing right beside Carlos, could only wipe his cold sweat off his forehead, realizing that something wrong was happening in the store. Why did this thing happen in such a crucial time? He thought to himself. "Mr. Huo, let's go check what happened," he said with utmost respect, trying to hide his embarrassment and fear of what would come out from this incident. A few minutes before Debbie started the commotion, Carlos had arrived at the mall to inspect it with no prior notification. That day, the mall's senior executives had come as quickly as they could to meet him. Not a single soul in the management had known of Carlos' arrival ahead of time, and for such a thing to happen, nobody knew how he would react. With such a messy sight, Carlos' face grew darker and darker. This left the general manager in a cold sweat. Judging by the face of his boss, the general manager guessed Carlos didn't hear his suggestion. All that time, his eyes were fixated on the store. Gail stood up after picking up her wallet. The next moment, a man was seen being pushed out of the store by a girl. With this, more and more passers-by gathered and stopped by to look in the hallway, gossiping in low voices. After taking a glance at the man's face and recognizing who he was, the general manager held his breath, his heart skipping a beat. "Damn it! What has this good-for-nothing done this time?" He cursed inwardly. Victor, who had been pushed out by Debbie, ran back into the store and grabbed her wrist, shouting, "How dare you lay your finger on me? This time, you were screwed." His eyes were burning, his hand gripping harder on Debbie's wrist. People who witnessed his violence thought that the girl would be at loss. However, Debbie didn't even bat an eyelash, fearless as she'd always been. Worried, Casey and Christina were about to help their friend, but Debbie signaled them to stop and lowered her head to look at the man's hand. She could feel his grip getting harder, but it didn't stop her from fighting back. Suddenly, she grabbed his arms and gave him an overarm throw effortlessly. She could bear Gail's attitude towards her, for she could never beat a girl. However, there was no way she couldn't beat a man who dared to offend her. Seeing her attack, the crowd was in awe. Some even applauded her actions. "Ugh!" Victor cried in pain. His voice reverberated on the third floor. It was clear to everybody that he was truly in pain. "Ugh! Let go of me," he repeated. As the commotion continued, more and more people gathered around, blocking Carlos' sight. Being able to take a short glance at the girl, he felt she looked familiar. Why is the girl so familiar? Carlos thought. Damn it! Suddenly, he realized who she was. After learning that it was Debbie, he immediately trotted towards the store, pushing people away in front of him. After seeing Carlos' menacing yet prominent figure, the crowd stepped back and let him through. With his brows furrowed, the general manager and his companions sighed inwardly. "We are done." Meanwhile, Debbie released Victor from her grip. She looked more arrogant than ever after what she had done. Victor remained silent. After a while, when the pain went off a bit, Gail helped him as he was struggling to stand straight. Furious, he cast a ferocious glance at Debbie and raised his arm, ready to give her a slap. But as he was about to give her a hard smack, she blocked his arm and gave him a hard kick in the crotch. "Were you trying to slap me? Who do you think you are?" Debbie exclaimed. Casey and Christina were in awe from their friend's strength and bravery. "Tomboy, you're awesome." Casey clapped her hands and exclaimed in excitement. Debbie, on the other hand, acted like she didn't hear her and continued to stare at Victor, who was now curling in pain on the floor. Meanwhile, Christina, who was also drooling over Debbie, said, "Tomboy, you're so handsome. I love you so much." Amidst their excitement, Carlos, who was inches away from the store, was not in a good mood. Hearing the man's painful cry and his wife being called tomboy, he thought, "Tomboy? What the hell? Just how could she be so fearless?" Unlock the magic of reading with Sigma Nu Epsilon Iota Eta. I've heard many of her friends calling her tomboy. Is she not a girl? Why can't she act like one even just for a single day? He cried in his mind. Contrary to her friend's amazement, he felt a little disappointed about her not being womanlike. Intimidated by his strong aura, the crowd stepped further aside so that Carlos could see what happened and walk through. Seeing Victor lying on the floor, struck with pain and moaning, Carlos stared at him for a second and then glanced at Debbie. Sparing him no mercy, Debbie was looking down at him, ready to give him another kick if he got up. Pained, "Damn bitch, I swear I'll teach you a hard lesson today," Victor said through gritted teeth as he finally struggled to his feet. Knowing what had really happened, many onlookers couldn't help but giggle at his awkward position. This time, Gail didn't dare to come and help her boyfriend. She was afraid that she would be beaten by her cousin. Meanwhile, Victor's arrogance made Debbie want to teach him one good lesson. She raised her leg and kicked him in the abdomen. Again, he cried and crossed his hands over his belly. He almost fell back on the floor. Struggling to fight off the pain, he took several deep breaths, staggered towards Debbie, and was about to slap her in the face. However, his arm was blocked again, this time not by Debbie, but by a man behind him. It was not until then that Debbie paid attention to the man standing behind Victor. It took her a second to realize who he was. Suddenly, an icy shiver ran down her spine. What the fuck? Not again. Why is he everywhere? she shouted inside. With her eyes widened, she asked, "Why?" but could no longer continue. Is he shopping with another woman this time? She thought to herself. Or maybe, just maybe, does he have a thing for me? Could he be stalking me? She wondered. Questions kept on popping up in her mind as she tried to understand his presence. On the other hand, Victor, not knowing who was standing behind him, scolded him harshly. Who the hell would try to stop? But as soon as he turned his head, he shut his mouth, looking closely at the man's cold eyes. He looks so intimidating, and his face looks familiar, he thought. I think I've seen him somewhere. I remember him. He's Mr. Huo, he silently exclaimed. How come he's here? Does he know this bitch? The very thought brought Victor out in a cold sweat. Annoyed, Carlos shook him off. Victor was once again thrown onto the floor. He rolled about 3 meters before he finally stopped. Once again, everyone burst into laughter. They thought, how could a man be so entangled on such a funny scene? However, several others didn't laugh. They were Debbie and the senior executives of the mall. Surprised by his presence, Casey and Christina wondered why Carlos was there. It seemed like they had forgotten that Debbie was in trouble with Carlos, and they were now drooling over his handsome face. Debbie was about to greet her husband, but she lost her words when she caught sight of his cold eyes. The once strong and fearless woman, who had just beaten up a man, now seemed to act like a little girl who was about to get scolded. She clenched her clothes and lowered her head, like an obedient wife. Oh no, is he going to throw me out of the mall again? She thought. This time I'm screwed. Just why is he here? After staring at Debbie, who was now acting so obedient, Carlos turned to look at the saleslady and coldly asked, "What happened?" Dominated by his prominent, alluring figure, the saleslady didn't dare to utter a single word. Curious of the man who just appeared, Gail, who was standing not far away, widened her eyes upon seeing Carlos. The man is so handsome, she realized. I remember him. He didn't even punish me for what I've done on his launch event. He must have a thing for me, she thought, giggling a little. Amused by her own idea, she plucked up some courage and went up to him, feigning a soft and innocent voice. Mr. Huo, I'm Gail Mu. I took a fancy to a collar pin in this store. Then I went to the ladies' room for a bit, and when I came back, my classmate already took it away. I told her that it was already reserved for me, but she didn't listen. Mr. Liu, the vice general manager, also persuaded her, but it went in vain. Not only did she not listen to a word we said, she even beat Mr. Louis. What? She didn't even mention that Victor is her boyfriend. Is she trying to pick on Carlos? What a slut, Debbie thought after hearing her words. Not giving a care to Gail's words, Carlos didn't even cast a single glance at her. He just looked at Debbie and then stepped into the store asking, "Where's the collar pin?" Immediately, a salesgirl held an embroidered box in her cupped hands and passed it to him. Reaching his arm out, he took the box over, opened it and looked at the collar pin and the brooch. Why would Debbie want to buy a collar pin and a brooch? Could it be that she only wanted to stir up trouble for the girl? He thought, wondering why Debbie would go to such extremes for such things. Mr. Huo, please let me handle this, said the general manager with a flattering smile on his face as he sauntered closer. He knew better than to trouble a man like Carlos with such trivial matters. More importantly, if Carlos was to deal with the problem himself, the general manager and a few other senior executives might end up getting fired. Everyone heard how the general manager had addressed Carlos. Ah, so he is Mr. Huo. People stared at Carlos in awe and wonder. Shining International Plaza is under ZL Group, and the head of ZL Group is Mr. Huo. So that makes him Mr. Huo, the CEO of ZL Group. Mr. Huo, He looks so handsome. I'm so excited. I'm so lucky to see him. Hurry, pinch me. Am I dreaming? Is that the real Mr. Huo standing in front of me? The women among the onlookers began to cheer at the top of their lungs. All the while, Debbie had looked at them, slack-jawed, wondering why they weren't intimidated by him. Before long, the security guards arrived and began to clear the site. They also set up a two-man blockade in front of the store to prevent others from entering. Only the people involved in the incident were left in the store. Tomboy, that's Mr. Huo. Wow, it must be fate that keeps bringing you two together time and time again, Casey whispered in Debbie's ear, excited. This time, Carlos didn't ask his men to throw Debbie out of the mall. Was he starting to get used to her? Debbie was rendered speechless. She rolled her eyes and threatened, "Shut up! Yes, I know he is Mr. Huo. I'm not deaf, nor am I blind. What a fake friend you are. Did you forget how this man treated me in the past?" Debbie cast a scornful glance at Casey. I wonder why she rolled her eyes at me? Casey was confused at Debbie's reaction. Meanwhile, Gail's heart raced uncontrollably as she lost herself in her wishful thoughts. If Mr. Huo falls for me and marries me, I will become the most respected woman in Y City. No, in the whole world. Every woman will envy me then. I can do whatever I want. Trying to calm herself down a bit, Gail walked up to Carlos in the most elegant way and looked at him with her innocent doe eyes. Come in here. Without even casting a glance at Gail, Carlos locked his eyes on his wife and asked her to come in. Debbie hesitated, shivering with fear, and then walked towards the man reluctantly. I can't let jail move frame me like that. I must do something. Wait, how did she act when her boyfriend was here? Debbie tried her best to retrace Gail's actions. Then she took everyone by surprise with a few special moves of her own. She straightened herself up, got close to Carlos, and took his arm in hers before she said, in a soft voice she had never used before, Mr. Huo, I was threatened by her. She pointed at Gail. Carlos peeked sideways at her arms around his and realized what she was going to do. She is going to use me, he mused. The bag in Christina's hand dropped on the floor as she murmured in utter disbelief, Oh my God! Has Debbie gone mad? Is she trying to seduce Mr. Huo? Carlos had threatened to bury Debbie alive the other night. How did they get so close now? Casey gently yanked Christina's arm and asked in confusion, Is she out of her mind? Mr. Huo was just starting to put their past disputes behind him, and now she is trying to stir up trouble again? Why is she holding his arm so tightly, where every word sparks wonder? Gail stood there paralyzed from the neck up, unable to comprehend what had just occurred. Burning rage hissed through her body when she noticed the intimacy between Carlos and Debbie. That dirty bitch. Why is she such a thorn in my side? She cursed inwardly, disregarding everyone else around her. Debbie pouted her lips at Carlos and complained, Mr. Huo, I took a fancy to the collar pin and wanted to buy it for you as a gift, but when I was about to pay, that woman and her boyfriend stopped me. She played the victim in such a pettishly charming manner that the people who knew her began to shiver. Her voice was soft, and to add more effect, she even stomped her feet gently, just as Gail had done before. As a matter of fact, she pulled off acting like an innocent girl quite well, and she appeared more natural than Gail. People who didn't know her would easily think that she was just a helpless little flower who stole people's hearts with her innocence. Carlos looked at her performance, his face deadpan, but he didn't shake her arms off. Meanwhile, the general manager cowered in the corner, wishing he could bury his head in the sand somewhere. Who is this girl? What's her relationship with Mr. Huo? Why does every woman want to seduce him? He thought. Casey and Christina held each other as they were unable to stand on their own. They didn't know why Debbie was acting like this. Casey, I guess we need to take Tomboy away from Mr. Huo and run away as far as possible. Look at his face. He must be so angry. What if he asks his men to throw her out again? Christina asked. Casey patted her hand to calm her down and answered, Don't worry. Look, Mr. Huo didn't shake her hands off. Maybe things are not as bad as what we think they are. Christina finally calmed down a little. However, neither girl was able to figure out what Carlos was thinking, since he was just standing there poker-faced. I thought Mr. Huo and Debbie hated each other very much. Since when did they become so close? Both Christina and Casey thought. The general manager approached Debbie in an attempt to take her away from Carlos, as he assumed she was making him angry. Miss, if you have any grievances, please come with me. We'll try our best to meet your needs. He reached out his hand towards Debbie. However, before he could touch her, a man's hand grabbed his wrist. Christina and Casey held each other more tightly to support themselves as they watched with great anticipation from the corner. They couldn't believe their eyes. Christina, did you see that? Casey asked her friend. Her only concern now was the relationship between Carlos and Debbie. She didn't even have time to smoothen her messy hair. Of course, Christina saw Carlos protect Debbie from the general manager. Her eyes had been glued to them from the very beginning. Christina nodded and asked, Do you reckon they finally fell in love with each other after having been through so many fights? The two girls looked at each other in awe. Then one nodded, but the other shook her head. How's that possible? I have seen lovers turn against each other, but I've never heard of enemies becoming lovers. Casey cast a scornful glance at Christina, as she felt like she was overreacting. Then they turned their heads back to watch the fun. The general manager withdrew his hand in embarrassment. He finally realized that there must be something between Carlos and the girl. Gail looked at Carlos in disbelief and wondered what their relationship was. Debbie is a sneaky little bitch. Since when has she been with Mr. Huo? No wonder she was so bold last time when she said, Who told you Mr. Huo turned me down? So she is Mr. Huo's mistress? That can't be possible. There's not even a chance in hell for someone like Mr. Huo to have a thing for a woman like Debbie. Gail consoled herself in her mind. Why don't you go pay the bill? Carlos passed the box to Debbie. She flashed a wide, satisfied grin and walked over to the cashier's desk. He took my side this time, she thought cheerfully. The people in the store all heard what Carlos said. They didn't dare to disobey him. The cashier immediately put on a hospitable smile and charged the item to Debbie's bank card. Debbie felt like someone had squeezed the life out of her, as she glanced at the invoice and put it inside her purse, nonchalantly. With the box in her hand, she walked over to Carlos and gave him the gift. In a sweet and soothing voice, she said, I want to apologize to you for what I've done in the past. Please forgive me. After he forgive me, maybe we can sit together and talk about our marriage in a calm manner. She thought. She wanted to put our differences aside. So, that's why she bought the collar pin for me. The thought gladdened Carlos, and his satisfaction showed on his face. A sapphire collar pin? I've never tried this color before. Mr. Huo, I will be leaving with my friends now. Shortly after Debbie handed the gift to Carlos, she bid him farewell as she was afraid that he would make trouble with her again. Just after saying goodbye to Carlos, Debbie grabbed her two friends, who were still caught in a daze, and left the mall as quickly as they could. A foreboding darkness took over Carlos' face as he handed the gift to his secretary and swept his eyes over the crowd before he ordered the general manager. Call the other senior executives. We need to have a meeting now. Carlos gave everyone shivers as he strode past them and proceeded to the conference room of the mall. The senior executives on the site palpitated with terror and thought, a drastic management change will ensue. In a beverage shop named Number 99 Milk Tea, Three girls were drinking their pudding milk tea in silence. After a big gulp, Casey decided to speak up. "Tell us what was going on between you and Mr. Huo." She winked and flashed a wicked grin at Debbie, who was so nervous that tiny beads of sweat started popping out of her forehead. Debbie knew they wouldn't let her go easily if she didn't tell them anything. After a brief consideration, she explained with a pitiful look, "All of this started from that kiss between Mr. Huo and me that night. He felt offended by me, and because of that, I've had such a hard time these past few days. Christina, you heard him the other night. He wanted to bury me alive. As if that weren't bad enough, I accidentally bumped him with my car last night. What lousy luck. Fortunately, he was not injured. Otherwise, I might have been dead by now." Fearing that they were going to see through her lies, she lowered her head and slowly sipped her milk tea through a straw. "Sorry, Carlos. I lied to them about bumping you with my car. I had no other choice. If I told them the truth, they would react in the same way as Jared did and send me to a mental hospital." Debbie sensed that the two girls were not fully convinced, so she continued, "Alas, I kissed him at the bar first. Then I offended him in Shining International Plaza. Last night, I almost ran him over with my car. I had to apologize to him for the sake of my own safety. And do you think a verbal apology would suffice? Come on. He's the richest man in Y City." Still, the two girls looked unconvinced. "I don't think the sapphire collar pin would work either. He is a man of wealth." "I don't think he would like the gift," Christina retorted. Initially, Christina thought that the collar pin, which cost nearly $200, would make a great gift as it was expensive and extravagant. However, on second thought, when she remembered that Carlos was the richest bachelor in Y City, she realized that it wasn't going to satisfy his taste. "Of course, it's not going to work. I was afraid that he would reject the gift, so I ran away from the mall as fast as I could." Debbie wiped the sweat off her forehead. Why was it so hard to tell a lie? Why couldn't they believe that Carlos was her husband? Casey smoothed her hair and teased, "Tomboy, I believe what you're saying is the truth. I don't think a rich bachelor like Mr. Huo will fall for a tomboy like you. Look at you, you don't even have big boobs or a juicy butt." Debbie slammed her palm on the desk and argued, "Hey, watch your tongue. I have a perfectly good figure." The topic had been successfully changed, but Debbie still had a lingering fear at the back of her mind that she couldn't shake off. Casey and Christina eyed their friend from head to toe and looked at each other before bursting into laughter. Debbie knew what their laughter meant. She raised her chest up and snorted with laughter. "I'll ask Julie to make me nutritious dishes every day so that my boobs will grow big." The three of them had hot pot that evening. After saying goodbye to her friends, Debbie went back to the villa. The weather was getting colder. She pulled her coat close and opened the gate of the villa. "It's only 9 p.m., and I don't think Carlos would be back so soon," she thought. She hummed a song as she changed her shoes and walked up the stairs. "You are the one, and you knew it anyway. If I said I love you, would you say it back? La la la." "Ag!" A heart-rending scream broke the silence. Carlos looked at the girl in front of him, expressionless. Was he that scary? If Debbie hadn't held onto the rails tightly, she would have rolled down the stairs. What was Carlos doing home at this hour? That was weird. "You need to go to the university early tomorrow morning. So don't stay up late," Carlos said indifferently, as he cast a glance at her and walked down the stairs with an empty glass in his hand. Debbie nodded slowly, still feeling a bit shaken up. I better listen to him. She took a deep breath to recollect herself before she left for her bedroom and locked the door behind her. The next day, a girl with long hair and a white dress was reading a book on psychology in a large classroom. A gentle smile was hanging on her lips. Her name was Gail. Although she seemed to be reading her book, Her attention was focused on the conversation of the students behind her. Hey, did you guys hear that? Debbie Nian, who has a strong family background, has been seen riding a luxurious car recently. The car is worth tens of millions of dollars. Yes, I heard that. Does she have a sugar daddy? Are you kidding me? She doesn't even dress like a girl at all. I think she's a lesbian. I don't think men would find her attractive. Look at our Gail, on the other hand. She is so pretty and elegant. She could be our Miss University, commented a boy with pimples all over his face while giving Gail a flattering smile. Deep down in her heart, Gail was thrilled, but she managed to keep herself calm. Debbie must be from a prominent family. I couldn't hold a candle to her. Sarcasm was pouring out of her voice, but the others were unable to spot it. The boy was not convinced. Gail, you come from an affluent family as well. What's more, we don't actually know Debbie's family background. I guess she cooked up a story on her mysterious family background and spread it around herself. His voice was so loud that everyone in the classroom heard it. Many students wanted to chime in with him, but when they saw the girl staring at the boy with a fierce look in her eyes, they all lowered their heads and pretended to read. However, Gail and the boy failed to notice this. Don't say it like that. My dad merely owns a small company, she said with a timid smile. Gail was pretending to be modest on purpose. Thinking of Gail's family resources, they look at her with eyes beaming with admiration. Gail, your father is a CEO. But what about Debbie Nian? I heard that she is an orphan. Her father died a long time ago. Her mother abandoned her. Bang! Before he could continue, the door of the classroom was kicked open all of a sudden. When he saw who was standing at the door, he cowered in fear, face as pale as a ghost. When did Debbie Nian get here? Are we going to have the lesson with her class? Did she hear what I said? Standing behind Debbie were several boys rubbing their fists, eager for a fight. This made the boy feel more frightened and intimidated. Debbie scowled at the boy as she was really irritated by his comments regarding her parents. She cast a short glance at the camera in the classroom and gave Jared a wink. Jared immediately understood what she meant. As the tallest boy in the university, he grabbed a chair and covered the camera with a book. Tomboy, I was wrong. Please forgive me. The boy apologized to Debbie as he was soon surrounded by several boys with malicious smile and a thirst for violence. Ah, now you are apologizing to me? When you spoke ill of my parents, did you ever realize that I would be PZ'd? Debbie thought. As soon as she made a gesture with her hand, the boys threw him to the floors and started beating him. The boy cried in pain, but nobody in the classroom dared to come forward to help him. On one hand, the boy deserved it, and on the other hand, they didn't want to cross Debbie. Gail was gripped with fear when she saw what was happening. She turned to look at Debbie and wondered, does she know that I went to the dean's office yesterday to file a complaint against her? What a shameless hooligan. All she knew is how to bully others. Why hasn't the dean or the principal kicked her out of the university yet? Bah! 5 minutes later, Debbie left the classroom with her hands in her pockets, followed by her companions. The boy staggered to his feet. His body swayed a bit while his face remained unscathed. His attackers made sure to hit him everywhere except for his face. It hurt so much, he twitched in pain. As he watched Debbie walking away, he swore to himself that he would stay away from this hooligan as much as possible. Dive into stories, embrace enchantment. In the classroom, the students whispered amongst themselves and stole glances at the boy who had just been beaten up by Debbie and her companions. Needless to say, they were jeering at him. Gail didn't even cast a single glance at the boy despite the fact that he had spoken ill of Debbie to fawn on her. The boy was boiling with rage, but he could do nothing to vent his anger. He swore to himself that he would report the incident to the dean. In the afternoon, While the teacher was giving a lecture, Debbie rested her cheeks on her hands and thought, "Is the boy going to tell the dean that I beat him up? If he does, I swear I'll give him another hard lesson, where stories blossom." As soon as the bell rang, our Kelly's "I Believe I Can Fly" was on the air. However, just after a few seconds, the song was interrupted by the broadcaster's voice. "Debbie Nian of Class 22, please go to the dean's office now. Debbie Nian of Class 22, please go to the dean's office." The broadcaster repeated it 3 times. Everyone in the university had heard it loud and clear. Although this was not the first time Debbie had been called into the dean's office, she still felt a little embarrassed. She stood up from her chair and grabbed Dixon along with her to go to the dean's office. The reason Debbie brought Dixon with her was that he was a straight-A student and was a favorite of most teachers. Every time Debbie was called to go to the dean's office, she would bring him along, and with his interceding for her, the dean would let her go more easily. Debbie assumed that the dean wanted to see her this time was because of that boy she had beaten up this morning. However, since the camera in the classroom had been covered during the whole process, she decided to simply deny that such a thing had ever happened. "Dude, how dare you? I swear I'll beat the shit out of you." Debbie entered the dean's office, her face expressionless. Having been in a similar situation countless times before took away the seriousness of it all. She yanked Dixon's sleeve and dragged him in. To her surprise, the dean was bending over and pouring tea for a man sitting on the couch, as she flooded her face with a big grin. Debbie felt an icy shiver running down her spine at the sight of the man's face. Immediately, she pushed Dixon out of the office. Considering the circumstances, she wouldn't be able to protect herself, let alone protect her friend. She didn't want to get Dixon in trouble for her selfish reasons. "Debbie, here you are." The dean smiled at Debbie, who was about to leave with Dixon, and gestured her to come in. Out of curiosity, Dixon turned around to look back, when the man's cold glance darted to the office door at the same time. The mere sight of the man's icy glare had his legs quivering to the point where he thought he was going to fall to the floor. "Why is Mr. Huo here? I better get away from here while I can," he thought, and fled the office immediately. Debbie was also confused. "Why is he here? I thought I was going to see Philip here as usual. After all, the dean only has his number. When I figure out who called Carlos, I swear I am going to paint the walls with his blood. I won't even spare the dean if I find out that she was behind this." Debbie trembled with fear, her heart in her mouth, as she stood outside the door worrying. "Debbie?" The dean walked over to Debbie, her voice so amiable. She had always been aware that Carlos was Debbie's backer, so she didn't dare to punish her, even though Debbie had violated the code of the school many times. She was surprised by the fact that an important man like Carlos made an effort to come here by himself. "Wow, this is the first time I've met him in the flesh." If the principal and the vice principals hadn't been away on official business, they would have been here to receive Mr. Huo now. Debbie gave the dean a wry smile. "Hi, we meet again, but I don't want to get in," she whispered in the dean's ear so that Carlos wouldn't hear her. The dean looked surprised by her words. She didn't know that a naughty girl like Debbie could be so afraid of Carlos. "Debbie Nian," came an impatient voice from inside the office, causing Debbie to jump to her feet. She approached the dean and whispered, "Who called him?" The dean was a little surprised by Debbie's apprehensive behavior. Although the dean was in her early 30s and considerably young for her profession, she kept a strict disposition in front of the students. No one had ever dared to get close and talk to her so casually like Debbie did. Considering the fact that Carlos was Debbie's guardian, she cast her thoughts about Debbie aside and decided not to mind that. "I called Philip. I didn't expect Mr. Huo to come here either." Like Debbie, the dean spoke in a low voice as well. Without further ado, They entered the office together. 3 of them sat face to face. Debbie looked at the dean. The dean looked at Carlos and he looked at Debbie. "Why did you fight that boy?" Carlos broke the silence. While pouting her lips, Debbie turned to stare out the window and said indifferently, "He deserved it." Her voice was calm and collected. "Seriously? That's your answer?" The dean was at a loss for words. "She is never going to change." All of a sudden, Carlos raised his voice and asserted, "Give me a better reason." He held back his anger as he kept telling himself that she was still young and he needed to be more patient with her. The palpable atmosphere in the room made Debbie uneasy. However, instead of cowering with fear, she retorted, "He spoke ill of me behind my back, and when I caught him red-handed, I decided to teach him a good lesson." She boldly raised her head to meet the man's eyes. She wore impudence on her face so proudly. However, her courage lasted only 2 seconds, and in the third, she looked away, because she didn't want to be frozen to death by his cold eyes. "Debbie, you can turn to me if it happens again. I will discipline the likes of him." The dean chimed in to smooth things over when she saw Carlos' long face. Debbie scoffed, "Come on, I'm not a 3-year-old kid. We are adults and we can figure it out by ourselves." Lacking the proper words to voice her response, the dean turned to look at Carlos. "I'm taking her back home now." Carlos stood up and walked towards the door without looking back at the 2 women. Debbie clenched her fist tightly and resisted. She didn't want to obey his orders, but no matter how unwilling she was, she had no choice but to follow him. Debbie and Carlos both sat in the back seat and remained silent all the way. The driver didn't dare to utter a single word. Upon arriving at the destination, Carlos stepped into the house and lit a cigarette before he made himself comfortable on the couch. "Smoking again? I saw him smoke many times. Is he a chain smoker?" Debbie wondered. His handsome face became unclear behind the smoke, and she was unable to read his facial expression. After he finished his cigarette, neither he nor Debbie uttered word. Soon after, he lit another cigarette and continued smoking again. Debbie was overwhelmed with anxious thoughts. "Say something, okay? Whatever you want to do to me, just go ahead and say it. Don't leave me in suspense." After a brief pause, she broke the silence. "Mr. Huo, I'll go and fetch some fruits for you." With a flattering smile, she eagerly looked at the man in front of her, waiting for his response. However, a few minutes passed, and he still hadn't said anything. Disappointed, Debbie furrowed her eyebrows and walked towards the kitchen. She took out an avocado, some cherries, and some grapes, and arranged them nicely on the plate. Before long, she came out of the kitchen and placed the plate on the table in front of him. Please have some fruits." Debbie gave him a gentle smile and handed him a fruit fork. Yet, silence still lingered over the room like an impending doom. Carlos threw the cigarette butt into the ashtray and looked back at her, completely ignoring the fact that she had been holding a fork in her hand for him. Carlos had always treated Debbie like a child instead of his wife. All he wanted was for her to be a good person with a proper education, but he had gotten in way over his head. Finally, she grew impatient of keeping her hand raised for such a long time. "Never mind." She threw the fork back onto the plate. "What do I have to do to appease him? I have never fawned on anyone at university. However, I spent $188,000 on a present for him just to make him happy. Why is he still so angry at me? Did I spend all that money for nothing? It seems to me that his attitude towards me hasn't changed one bit. I can't keep buying him presents to make him happy. It isn't feasible," Debbie reflected. Carlos raised an eyebrow and looked at the fork Debbie had thrown onto the fruit tray with an expressionless face. Finally, she can't take it anymore. I just want her to behave like an upstanding citizen of society. Is that too much to ask for? Go to your room. You are grounded for 1 week. Carlos shifted his stern gaze towards her. Grounded for 1 week? You've got to be kidding me. Debbie's eyes and her mouth were frozen wide open in an expression of stunned surprise. She would rather have him give her a tongue lashing or a good flogging instead of keeping her confined at home. I object. She walked towards Carlos, pouting willfully. Object? The word was alien to Carlos' ears. No one had ever dared to defy him before. Without hesitation, he cast a cold glance at the girl standing in front of him and said, "Denied." His tone sounded even colder than the expression on his face. For a moment, Debbie wanted to give up the fight. Judging by the look on his face, she thought it would be a cold day in hell before he would agree to withdraw his punishment. Be cool. Take a deep breath. Don't be afraid. He is just some guy, a human, much like you. She comforted herself, trying to calm down. But the man was so intimidating and terrifying, he reminded her of a demon from hell. Carlos Huo, I don't want to be grounded for 1 week. I will go crazy, Debbie protested. If you keep acting this way, your teacher will go crazy. He returned flatly without even looking at her. Hey, old man, don't you think you are being too strict? And why do you care so much about this? Why do you have to poke your nose into everything? Carlos could feel the blood rushing to his head as his face turned red with anger. She was not a child anymore. Why did she still behave like one? Her rebellious teenager days had been over a long time ago, but it seemed to him that she was still far from being an adult. Debbie was smart enough to tell that he was angry. If you ground me, I will climb out of the windows and make a run for it, she went on. All of a sudden, Carlos stood up, towering over her like a tyrant. You can give it a try if you want to challenge me. Carlos ended the discussion there and then walked out of the villa. Challenge him? She wouldn't dare. Hey, where are you going? We are not done yet, Debbie shouted. She tried to run after him, but Philip stopped her. Debbie, Mr. Huo said that you are not allowed to go outside for 1 week. Philip looked at Debbie, who was seething in anger, and felt sorry for her. Silly girl, he mused. When the Bugatti Veyron sped out of the villa, Debbie glared at it hard as if she were trying to set the car on fire with the flames in her eyes. In the end, to make things less difficult for Philip, she went back to her room sullenly. Just after 30 minutes had passed, Debbie started pacing around her room restlessly. When she tried to find a way to sneak out using a rope, she heard strange noises coming from outside the window of her bedroom. When she looked outside, she found 2 men on ladders installing an anti-theft window for her bedroom. Almost immediately, Debbie's face went red with suppressed rage. Just because he is my husband doesn't mean that he can restrict my freedom like this. Carlos, why are you so overbearing? Divorce. I want a divorce. I have to divorce you. There was no denying the fact that she had taken financial support from Carlos. She had even asked Jared to help her find a job so that she could pay him back once she was able to. When she thought of how Carlos had supported her and taken care of her in the past 3 years, her anger and resentment towards him gradually dissipated. After the marriage registration, Carlos had been providing her with nothing but the best in everything. Moreover, when her father was still alive, Carlos had helped him with important matters as well, inspiring minds, illuminating souls, while she, on the other hand, had done nothing but provoke him, despite the fact that he was her husband. Instead of requiting his concerns, she had been trying to divorce him. It wouldn't surprise her if Carlos was disappointed in her. Looking at the busy workers, she decided not to follow through with her escape plans. At 10 p.m., when Carlos got back to the villa from work, he didn't stop to rest or go to bed. Instead, he went to his study and continued working from there. While he was meticulously going over some data, he heard a knock on the door. At this late hour, it must be her. What does she want? He wondered. Come in. With his permission, Debbie walked in cautiously with a glass of milk on a tray. Ashamed to look Carlos in the eye, Debbie kept her head low even after she had placed the glass of milk on the desk. About what happened earlier.
I'm sorry.
I figured milk would help you sleep better. Good night, said Debbie, her head still lowered, before she hurried out of the study.
Sorry.
Carlos kept a skeptical attitude, shifting his eyes from the door to the milk. Is this another one of her tricks? From that day on, Debbie brought a glass of milk to the study 3 nights in a row. On the 4th night, Carlos said to her, I'll take you to school tomorrow. Debbie was pleasantly surprised, and her eyes lit up with joy. Carlos let out a tiny smile from the corners of his mouth when he saw how happy she was. The next morning, as soon as the black limo came to a halt at the roadside, Debbie threw herself out of the car like a gust of wind and dashed towards the gate of the university. While sitting in the car, Carlos watched her disappear into the horizon with a smile on his face. She is still very cute. In the multimedia English class, the students were chattering in groups. When Debbie came in, a few of her classmates crowded around her and bombarded her with questions. Debbie, we haven't seen you for days. Where have you been? How come you didn't come to school? Did something happen? We were worried about you. Sitting at her desk, Debbie watched her friends with one hand propped against her chin. Guys, relax. I told you on WeChat. I was busy. Jared, who was sitting opposite her, scrutinized her for a while and then asked, Dixon said a powerful man went to the dean's office the other day. Confess. Who was he? Debbie rolled her eyes at his nosiness and glanced at Dixon, who was too scared to speak. A godlike man. Guess who it was? Her words attracted the contempt of some students because it wouldn't take much time to figure out who it was, since there were only 3 godlike men in Y City. Carlos and his 2 friends, Curtis and Wesley Lee. There was no way it could have been Carlos. Debbie's friends knew full well that she didn't see eye to eye with Carlos. It was a wonder how they hadn't killed each other yet. Curtis didn't fit Dixon's description. Couldn't be Wesley Lee either. According to the news, Wesley Lee had been working undercover previously and then as a commander. He hadn't taken a break for months. Recently, he had cracked a major child trafficking case. Since then, the army had granted him a 2-week vacation, which he had been spending for a much-needed rest in a country. Tomboy, it's not fair that you and Dixon are keeping a secret from us. Besides, Dixon already knows about it. Why can't we know? It's not fair, Christina complained, leaning on Debbie's shoulder. Seeing Casey acting like that, Debbie said exaggeratedly, Dixon, just tell her, or she will fall out with me out of jealousy. Baffled, Christina looked at Debbie and retorted, What? That's crazy. There's nothing going on between us. Why would I be jealousy? Dixon was confused and flustered. Christina, didn't you agree to be my girlfriend the other night? He asked. This was a big news for them. The crowd hooted. All of a sudden, they had forgotten about Debbie.
No, he didn't.
Christina blushed. She leaned on Debbie's shoulder and interlocked arms with her. Debbie, why haven't you been to the dorm lately? I missed you. The dormitory was the only place Debbie used to go to if she couldn't make it to the villa in the evening. However, Carlos had made it clear that she couldn't live in the dorm anymore, so her friends would have to wait until she managed to change his mind. Debbie stroked Christina's hair lovingly and sighed with resignation. Doll, I missed you too, but I can't stay in the dorm right now. You will have to wait a bit longer. Debbie comforted Christina and then planted a gentle kiss on her hand.
Debbie, no.
You can't turn into a lesbian. There are plenty of handsome guys in our class. Don't break their hearts like that. Dixon wailed upon seeing the two girls' intimate interaction. Debbie cast him a stare and assured him with a lustful look on her face, "Relax. I won't break the hearts of those pretty boys in our class." The class broke into laughter. Moments later, when the bell rang, the crowd dispersed and everybody went back to their designated seats. Before long, Professor Marks stepped into the classroom and deliberately cast a glance at Debbie, who was sitting in the back of the classroom. "Not bad. She looks energetic today," he mused. "Now the class begins," the professor announced. These days, although Debbie was still absent-minded in class, she didn't cause as much trouble as she used to. When her name hadn't been mentioned in the broadcast for a few days in a row, her schoolmates were surprised. After all, they had grown accustomed to hearing her name being called out every so often. Nonetheless, a leopard cannot change its spots. Just when her teachers and schoolmates thought that she was becoming a good student, Debbie was once again called into the dean's office because of cutting class for a whole week. Contrary to her expectations, this time, the dean let her leave the office with only a warning. Before she could figure out why the dean had suddenly decided to show her mercy, her phone beeped. It was a notification from WeChat. However, when she opened the message to read the news from her university's official account, her jaw dropped to the floor. The message stated that Carlos Huo was going to be a part-time lecturer at the university. "Hey, Debbie, have you read the news? Carlos Huo is coming to our school as a lecturer," Casey said excitedly, swinging her phone in the air as she clutched at Debbie's sleeve. Stunned, Debbie stared straight at Casey and nodded absent-mindedly. All of a sudden, a sense of dread closed in. She didn't know what she was dreading, but her instinct was telling her that something bad was going to happen.
No.
There was no way she would be his student. She had to come up with an excuse to ask for a leave, just until the duration of Carlos' stay at her university. In the doorway of the principal's office, Debbie stared at the brown door intensely. It seemed as if she were trying to bore a hole in it with her eyes. Why does a leave of more than 2 days require the principal's consent? There was no need for such requests before. Should I simply cut the classes or go into the principal's office and ask for his permission? Debbie was conflicted. 2 minutes later, she knocked on the door. Carlos was much scarier in person than Curtis. As a result, she decided that it would be easier to ask for permission for a leave from the latter than to suffer tormenting glares from the former for cutting class again. "Come in." Curtis had been waiting to hear from her ever since she had asked for a leave from her guidance counselor. "Mr. Liu," she greeted. Curtis had just made green tea, the fragrance of which filled the air in his office. "Grab a seat and have a taste of this Angie plain tea Carlos gave me," he said, pointing at a seat across the table. "Ugh, hi. That Carlos again. Why do I have to hear his name everywhere? And does Mr. Liu treat everybody so nicely?" Debbie wondered as she walked inside. She didn't plan on staying for tea, so she didn't sit down. "Mr. Dash, Carlos said that someone had given him this tea as a gift. It is very hard to find this in the market. Do have a taste," Curtis insisted before she could say more, transforming moments into memories. He poured some light sea green-colored tea in a cup and placed it in front of her. Having no other choice, Debbie pulled up a chair and sat down. The first sip crept over her taste buds and down her throat. The tea released such a rich, flavorful aroma and tasted so wonderful that even a casual tea drinker like Debbie fell in love with it instantly. She could finally understand why her principal had strongly recommended it. When she emptied her cup, Curtis was nice enough to refill it for her. "If you like it, you can take some with you." "No, thank you, Mr. Liu. I actually came here to ask you for a leave from school." She had to get it out before Curtis drove her crazy. Curtis looked at her and then smiled at her restless and impatient behavior. However, Debbie captured something strange in his eyes. What was that? Doting look. She thought she was just imagining things. I must be mistaken. Carlos is coming to our university to give lectures the day after tomorrow. He is a learned scholar. You should attend his classes. Trust me, you will benefit from it. So, my advice for you is to stay at school unless there is something urgent that you need to attend to. He was so polite and gentle that Debbie felt it would be embarrassing to cause a scene. I don't want to attend his classes. I want a 1-week leave, she said frankly. Curtis was about to refill his cup when her words registered in his mind and caused his hands to shake a little. You want to stay away from school just to avoid Carlos? Is that it? Debbie nodded. For the first time in his life, he found someone who hated Carlos so much. However, Curtis understood what she had meant. She sounded just like the Debbie Nian he knew all along. Okay, said Curtis. Debbie was baffled for a moment, shaking her head in disbelief. Okay? You mean I have your consent? She confirmed. Curtis raised his head and looked at her. If I say no, will you attend his classes? She was rendered wordless. At the same time, she realized how dangerous her principal was. She had underestimated his ability to read people's minds. Ironically, she had already made up her mind about cutting school in case Curtis refused to give her his permission, even before she walked into his office. At ZL Group, Tristan walked into the CEO's office with a file envelope in one hand. Mr. Huo, here is the information you wanted. Carlos stopped whatever he was doing to open the envelope and then carefully went through what was in the file. There were 5 pieces of paper. How did she meet Emmett? Before, when Mrs. Huo came here to see you, it was Emmett who received her. But that was it. There were no further contacts between them after that.
Carlos lit à cigarette.
What is her relationship with Jared Han? His eyes then shifted to the column about her hobbies and weakness, which specifically aroused his curiosity. What? Afraid of 4D plus movies, snakes, darkness? It seems like she isn't as tough as she looks. Just a little girl after all. Carlos chuckled when he read about her weakness. Tristan recalled how her friends had responded when he asked them about their relationships with Debbie. Dude, good buddies. They had all given the same answer. Tristan was especially amused by that. Okay, you may leave now. Yes, Mr. Huo. No sooner has Tristan turned around than he heard Carlos say, I don't want to see Emmett again in the next 2 years. Shocked to the bone, Tristan prayed for Emmett silently. Finally, it was Carlos' first day as a lecturer at the Economics and Management School. He started his day earlier than usual. However, to his disappointment, even after he had exercised, showered, and eaten his breakfast, he still didn't see Debbie anywhere. Philip, where is she? Philip knew Carlos was referring to Debbie. Mrs. Huo has asked for a 1-week leave from school. She went to the airport early this morning, he answered calmly. A 1-week leave? Why am I just hearing about this now? Philip lowered his head in silence, lacking any explanation. From now on, I want you to report her every move to me. Do you understand? Carlos ordered sternly and took out his phone. Yes, Mr. Huo. Where is she heading? And why? Philip hesitated for a second. Mrs. Huo didn't mention anything. Didn't mention anything? Discover your next adventure at Sigma Nu Epsilon Iota Eta. I guess she is avoiding me, Carlos wondered. Without further delay, he called Tristan and said, Inform the airport immediately that, within 1 hour, Debbie and her luggage showed up in the CEO's office at ZL Group. As soon as she stepped into the office, she left her luggage against the wall and hastened towards Carlos' desk. Mr. Huo, what's this supposed to mean? Why did you do this? Don't I have my own freedom anymore? Carlos didn't say a word until he had finished going through the papers in his hand. He raised his sights to her face and said, "Come to the university with me this afternoon."
No.
Debbie refused him outright. Disappointed, Carlos got out of his chair and asserted, "Too bad. You don't have a choice." Debbie slumped in an armchair in shock. Stunned, and not to mention angered, she finally spoke again after a moment. "Since you are not so busy right now, let's get to the matter we've been talking about without mincing our words. I've already signed the divorce papers. I really hope that you would do the same for me, for us, so that we can go our separate ways and carry on with our own lives." Ever since the idea of a divorce had popped into her head, it had always been there at the back of her mind. Moreover, Carlos had been interfering with her personal life lately. Far from feeling like she had married a husband, in truth, she felt like she had found herself a father. As stubborn and proud as she was, Debbie had never flattered anyone to gain favor, but lately she had been trying very hard to please her husband. As if that weren't bad enough, he wasn't making it any easier for her. Instead of having to see him only in the mornings and the evenings at the villa, she would now have to put up with him in her school. Debbie just couldn't catch a break with this man. It had to end today. She would much rather lay her cards on the table and get it over with. Carlos walked around the desk to the sofa across her and sat down. Divorce is not an option. He made himself very clear. "Why, I told you I don't want your money. I don't want anything from you. Why are you still refusing to sign the papers? What else do you want? What's wrong with this guy?" By then, she was so angry she wanted to rush over, choke him, kick him in the head, and throw him in Arctic Ocean. Giving him no time to respond, she went on, "I know I've spent a lot of your money in the past 3 years. Don't worry. I'll pay every penny back as soon as I find a job." Carlos sensed anger in her tone. When she finally finished speaking, he said, "I didn't do right by you in the past 3 years. I neglected you. I won't make the same mistake again in the future." Did he just apologize to me? Debbie didn't see that coming. There is no need for an apology. Anyway, you don't love me and I don't love you either. A loveless marriage between two people is meaningless. Furthermore, according to the law, married couples who stay apart for 2 years or more are automatically considered divorced. So if you still refuse to sign the divorce papers, I will have to sue you. Her last few sentences forced him to let out a chuckle. After all, this young lady was too naive. "Sueme? No problem. I can help her find the best lawyer in the city." But automatically divorced. Carlos felt obliged to correct her. "Listen, first of all, to be automatically divorced, the couple must be separated for 2 entire consecutive years. 1 year, 9 months, and 10 days ago, I went back to the villa and slept next to you, but you were too sound asleep to know it." Being the gentleman that he was, Carlos had kept the lights off so she wouldn't wake up, and it was too dark to see anything anyway. Nothing had happened between the two of them that night. Besides, he had only stayed for 2 hours and then left for work again. Debbie's eyes nearly popped out at his reply. "Hell no. I didn't even know a man was sleeping next to me." Carlos took out a cigarette, but since Debbie was present, he didn't light it. Playing with the cigarette in his fingers, he continued, "Secondly, the separation must be caused by the falling apart of the couple's relationship. In our case, I was working overseas. It doesn't fit the requirements, my dear. Besides, a divorce must be consented by both parties. There is no such thing as an automatic divorce." Debbie was so puzzled her face fell faster than a corpse in cement boots. In that instant, her mouth hung with lips slightly parted and her eyes were as wide as they could stretch. She started wondering if she should hire a lawyer to see if Carlos was trying to fool her. Thirdly, he suddenly stood up and moved towards her. Leaning over her with his hands on the arms of the chair, He pressed his face close to hers. Debbie was forced to lean back. What is he doing? Why is he so close? Is he trying to seduce me? Debbie thought nervously. All of a sudden, the air became thick with intensity. Sensing her tension, Carlos spoke again. The court requires evidence of a separation, which I am unable to present. What about you, my dear? Why does he keep calling me my dear? That form of address was starting to mess with Debbie's head. Why, yes, I can, she stammered. Oh, really? Where? How? Debbie scooted backwards in the armchair until there was no space left. I can ask Julie and Philip to help me. They can provide evidence. Do you think they will listen to you or me? Debbie didn't answer. Both of them knew very well what the answer to that question would be. Carlos was so close she could feel the man's warm breath on her face. Her rosy cheeks blushed red and her heart started beating faster. The worst part was, she has lost the nerve to push him away. Finally, let me tell you this. With that, he pressed his lips to hers, sending her to a blissful trance. Fortunately for Debbie, the kiss didn't last long. During the separation, neither of the couple fulfills their marital duties. My dear, if you will allow me, I'd love to fulfill my duties to you as a husband. As soon as he finished his last sentence, he stepped closer. When their faces were about to touch, Debbie shook her head in shame and said hurriedly, No, 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 no. Out of the blue, Carlos pulled her up and took her in his arms. Therefore, my dear, I think your best option is to stay married to me and stop letting your mind wander. By then, Debbie had already been bewitched. She looked at his gorgeous face and nodded her consent. His scent was intoxicating. The smell of his presence gave her a sense of security, and his lips tasted like heaven. Satisfied by the spellbound look in her eyes, Carlos smiled. No, this isn't right. Debbie suddenly pulled herself back to reality and shook her head to clear her mind. Why don't you want a divorce? You know it as well as I do that we don't love each other, she asked. Why? Carlos ran his fingers gently through her smooth hair. First of all, you need money to pull yourself through university and make your dreams come true. Secondly, I need a woman as an alibi to block all the other women out of my life. And lastly, my grandfather once said that he had our fortunes read. The fortune teller convinced him that our 8-character and constellations matched perfectly. What are the odds of two people being so perfect for you each other? Debbie was at a loss for words. 8 characters and constellations? Seriously? He is so crafty and smooth-tongued he should be a lawyer, she amused. Sensing her skepticism, Carlos continued persuading her. As I just said, in the past, the biggest problem in our marriage was me. You did nothing wrong. Please allow me to make amends. If it still doesn't work out between us, you can choose not to be with me then. But you can't cheat on me. That's my only request. Debbie swallowed and asked, What if you find someone you like during this period? The man cast her a hard look and continued, I won't give you a chance to like somebody else. Debbie had once told him that she had feelings for someone else. But now, Carlos realized that it was all a lie. It was just her strategy to make him consent to the divorce. At that moment, she felt the last bit hope go up in smoke. No, something is off. But she couldn't put her finger on what it was. Confused, she opened her mouth to say something and then closed it again. The words were frozen on her lips. The confused look on her delicate face and her rosy lips were too much for the man to resist. He lowered his head and gave her a second kiss. There it is. That's what's wrong. Debbie pushed him away. Why do you keep kissing me? The touch of his lips and his scent sent her into a heady trance. He must have been trying to seduce her. What's wrong with me kissing my wife? Carlos looked at her in puzzlement. Of course it's wrong. After I kissed you, you threw me out of the mall, into the ocean, and even threatened to bury me alive, Debbie reproached. Her anger boiled up inside at the thought of how he had treated her just because of a stupid kiss. Tut tut. Do all girls hold grudges and bring up old scores? Carlos thought sourly. You should have told me you are my wife at the mall, he replied defensively. He was enamored of Debbie's adorable and unique personality. If he had known that she was his wife, he would have never done any of those things. What? Is he trying to make it look like it was my fault? She rolled her eyes at him. Look at what has happened ever since you found out that I am your wife. You've been interfering in my personal life. You treat me like your daughter. You kept me locked up in the villa for days. You've been behaving badly at the university. I can't turn a blind eye to that. Education was a top priority for Carlos. That was the one thing he would not waver from. The air around them had become toxic. They glared at each other, eyes sparking with anger. You are a nosy old man. Old man? Carlos hated it when she called him that. His lips tightened into a thin line and his face darkened with dissatisfaction. He was only 7 years older than her. Carlos' eyes dimmed. He looked at Debbie sharply and took a step forward. Debbie took a step back, poised for defense. I'm warning you. If you come any closer to me, I won't hesitate to fight you. Fight me? Good. I can't wait. He abruptly pushed her on the desk behind her and then leaned forward. They found their bodies in an awkward and yet erotic posture. Debbie could hardly move. She wriggled and tried to free her arms, but to no avail. Let go of me, she demanded. Go to the university with me this afternoon and attend my class. Maybe you don't want to, but you have no choice. No more cutting school, especially my classes. At 3:30 this afternoon, my first class is International Finance. You know which classroom it is. If I don't see you there. Carlos pinched her on the waist as a warning. Debbie uttered a yelp and blushed with embarrassment. Do we have to talk like this? Can't you let go of me first? Elevating stories, elevating minds. No one had ever treated her like this. This old, lustful man had been disrespectful to her several times now. He'd better mind his actions, or someday he might become a eunuch in his sleep. Helpless, she glared at him with resentment as her cheeks puffed up. It seemed like the anger boiling up inside her was going to burst out at any moment. Fortunately, Carlos released her from his restraint. Soon, Tristan drove her back to East City Villa. After they had arrived, he made sure to give Debbie's luggage to Julie before he left. Mrs. Huo, Mr. Huo said that you must attend his class at 3:30. Tristan reminded her before he took off. She clenched her fists, feeling immensely irritated. He wants me to show up to his class? Well, guess what? I won't. At 3:30, Carlos walked into the multimedia classroom, which was packed with almost 1,000 students present. He started with a small speech, during which he swept over his audience. When he was sure Debbie wasn't there, his face clouded up. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Carlos realized that he had made a mistake. Before that moment, somewhere in his heart he had still believed that she wasn't a bad person. However, now it seemed to him that he had given her too much credit. It was a little past 6 p.m. when Debbie was seen in a cafe. She was talking to Jared on WeChat when 2 bodyguards appeared in the shop. Mrs. Huo, Mr. Huo asked us to pick you up, they said. Instead of responding to what they said, she continued talking on the phone. Puzzled, the bodyguards looked at each other, and then one of them said, Mrs. Huo, Mr. Huo has given us strict orders to carry you home on our shoulders, if that's what it takes. Please, by all means, do what you must, Debbie countered casually. Perhaps Carlos had anticipated that things wouldn't go smoothly with the bodyguards. One of the bodyguards took something out of his pocket and swung it before Debbie's eyes. When Debbie caught sight of what it was, she saw 2 certificates, which stated that both bodyguards were black belts in Taekwondo. One was a 7th Dan and the other was a 8th Dan. Debbie resignedly crammed the last bite of the dessert into her mouth, stood up from her chair and followed the bodyguards out of the shop meekly. Son of a bitch, where did Carlos find these Taekwondo masters? She cursed inwardly. Although she had practiced martial arts for 10 years, when faced with those 2 bodyguards, she didn't dare to pick a fight with them. Meanwhile, an emperor was parked at the roadside. When she reached the car, Debbie opened the door and saw the man in the back seat. His eyes were shut tight, as if he was taking a nap, completely unaware of the fact that she had opened the door. One of the bodyguards took the driver's seat and the other sat in the passenger's seat in the front. The car engine revved and sped out. After a while, Debbie realized that the car was taking them out of town. This isn't right. This is not the way home. The villa is in the East District and the car is driving westward, she reflected. Where are we going? She asked. No one answered her question, as if no one could hear her. Debbie got nervous and fidgety since she had defied Carlos again. The skies were getting darker and by the look of it, they were heading somewhere remote. Her heart throbbed inside her chest violently. Is he trying to find a place to bury me alive again? In the grip of silent panic, the air inside the car felt like it was suffocating her. Everything was so quiet, she could hear her own heart pounding in her chest. When the car finally came to a stop, the bodyguards got out of the car, but Debbie remained where she was. Her eyes caught sight of something. Was that a tombstone? The door on her side was opened by a bodyguard, who stood there waiting for her to get out. With the headlights on, Debbie glanced around. A chill crept up her spine. Bloody hell! A graveyard? Why would Carlos bring her to a graveyard in the evening? While she was trying to figure out what was on Carlos' mind, the bodyguards returned to the car. Hey, what's this supposed to mean? Debbie tried to open the doors, but they were all locked, so she started tapping on the windows helplessly. One of the windows in the back seat was rolled down. With a gloomy look on his face, Carlos said, "This is a martyr's park. Stay here and reflect on what you've done." Here? Didn't he know that she had a fear of darkness? If she couldn't deal with the fears in the villa, how would she deal with them alone in a cemetery? Fear gripped her entire body in an instant. I. Before Debbie could say anything else, the car drove off. As she helplessly watched the car drive away and disappear into the horizon, all she could do was curse Carlos 1,000 times in her heart. This was more terrifying than being buried alive to her. Trembling with fear, she barely managed to take out her phone. Unfortunately, the reception there was terrible. She tried to dial Jared's number anyway. As if the gods were screwing with her, Jared's phone was switched off. What the hell? We were just talking on the phone a moment ago. Debbie called Casey, Dixon, and lastly Christina. All of them had turned off their phones. Ha! Just when I need them the most, none of them can be reached. What kind of friends are they? Debbie was so frustrated she wanted to smash her phone. She gritted her teeth angrily. When she raised her head, she saw rows of tombstones standing there. It was as if they were all looking at her. Her heart started trembling and the cold breeze drove shivers down her spine. Be cool, guys. Rest in peace. I am not looking for any trouble, she muttered, as she spun around to make sure nothing was behind her. Meanwhile, her friends had been taken to a restaurant. A few men, dressed in black, had taken their phones and confined them to a room. Completely unaware of what was happening to Debbie, they enjoyed the gourmet food spread out on the table. On the other hand, in the cemetery, more than 10 minutes had passed, But Debbie still hadn't been able to call in a car or a taxi to get her out of that terrifying place. Anxious, scared, and alone. Salty tears spilled over onto her cheeks, leaving a tight, dry feeling. Crouching under a tree, she kept calling her friends on her phone and just about anyone she could reach at that moment. However, the reception was too weak. She tried and tried, but luck wasn't on her side. Am I going to spend the night here? Surely I'll be dead in the morning, she thought to herself, sitting on the cold ground. That asshole Carlos. What an arrogant, insensitive bastard to leave me alone here like this. What did I do wrong in my previous life for God to make me his wife and punish me? Martyrs, heroes, I'm sorry, but I don't mean to be rude. Please don't come near me. Please, 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 she begged, looking at the tombstones with her hands folded in front of her. Casey, Christina, Jared, and Dixon, if I make it out of here alive, I swear I'll never speak to you guys again. Oh, help me, God. She wondered what her friends were doing, and she couldn't understand why her best friends had all ditched her when she needed them the most. Then she thought of her husband who had put her in such a difficult position in the first place. Carlos Huo, you evil man. No wonder you have been single for the past 28 years. Then she realized something was wrong with that sentence. Oh right, he is my husband. We have been married for 3 years. She remembered. You deserve to be single for the past 25 years, you jerk. You're lucky to have me, she murmured to herself angrily. Again, she tried to contact everyone else on her phone, but the line didn't connect her even once. Debbie sat there, tired and dejected, as she buried her face in her arms. There was only one person left, her husband, the last person she wanted to ask for help. After letting out a deep sigh, she raised her head and dialed Carlos' number. Due to the lousy reception, she couldn't connect through until after she had dialed more than 10 times.
Carlos, I'm sorry.
I was wrong. Please take me back home, she blurted as soon as the phone was connected. Unfortunately, before she could finish her words, the reception broke off. Debbie was bordering on insanity. Once again, she thought of how Carlos had treated her in the past. He had stubbornly refused to end their marriage despite the fact that they didn't love each other. He had tried to force her into school when she wanted to leave just to avoid him. It seemed that in his eyes, everything she did was wrong. It wasn't fair at all. Why was he being so heartless and insensitive to her? A frustrated scream dragged up her throat, but it emerged as a groan, and soon it was followed by tears gushing out of her eyes. In the silent darkness, her raspy sobbing sounded creepy, even more so due to the fact that she was in a cemetery. The night watchman heard her crying, but he was too frightened to approach her, uncertain whether she was a human being or a ghost. Drops of tears kept falling ceaselessly. Leaning against the tree, she put one arm over her chest and covered her face with the other, brushing away the tears from time to time. Little did she know that a person was standing right in front of her all the while. The sobbing gradually subsided. She wiped her tears and decided to get out of that place on her own. I have to be brave. I can't let that pervert belittle me, she told herself, trying to muster up some courage. Ah! She screamed when she saw the man in front of her as soon as she stood up. Her shriek resounded throughout the cemetery. The startled birds in the trees took to the dark sky, flapping their wings restlessly. Wistful, exhausted, and terrified, Debbie lost her balance and was about to fall down when Carlos stretched out his arms and caught her. She was shaking like a dry leaf in his arms. Without hesitation, he held her close in his arms and helped her up. When Debbie saw the man's face, her tears went rogue, flooding her face. Put me down. What are you doing here? Didn't you want to leave me here alone? Why did you come back? She had never seen another man as hateful and petty as Carlos Huo. Before Debbie, numerous women had cried their hearts out in front of Carlos. Most of them cried because he had turned them down when they told him that they wanted to be his girlfriend. Nonetheless, their tears and desperation had made him despise them even more. He wished that they had lived on different planets, as far away from him as possible. Strangely enough, the woman weeping in his arms right now didn't make him feel anything like that. On the contrary, for some inexplicable reason, his heart broke for her. What fascinated him was the fact that, even when he had thrown her into the ocean, she didn't shed a single tear. Instead, she came back like a fighter. Carlos wanted to comfort her, but he didn't know how. "If you stop crying, I promise to get you out of here immediately." That was the only thing he could offer her. Fortunately, it worked. Debbie stopped weeping and glared at him, her eyes and nose red from the crying. On a second thought, she realized that he was all she could depend on at that moment. Swiftly, she withdrew her glare and looked away. Having noticed her varying facial expressions, Carlos felt a tug of attraction in his heart. Never had he laid eyes upon a girl so lovely. He cast his warm feelings aside momentarily and assumed his usual cold tone. "Are you thinking of how to get back at me when you get to the villa?" Darn, how did he know? Taken aback, Debbie was suddenly at a loss for words. "And no, I'm not," she denied, trying to appear composed. "Can we go now?" asked Debbie. The place was so grim and dreadful. The mere sight of her surroundings gave her goosebumps. "Will you attend my class tomorrow?" Carlos sounded calm. Look at her, pale, shaking, and sweating. What's so scary about this place? He couldn't understand what it was about the place that made her feel that way. I will attend your class tomorrow," she answered at once. The thought of being in the same classroom with Carlos couldn't be worse than this. At East City Villa. As soon as they got back to the villa, Debbie dashed into her bedroom and went to get a shower. She desperately needed to wash off the sweat, grime, and most importantly the bad aura from her body. Before going to sleep, Debbie posted a message in the group's chat with her friends. "Friendship ended," she said. "I want to sever all ties with all of you." Meanwhile, her friends had just been allowed to leave the restaurant. As soon as they got their phones back, Debbie's message popped up on their screens simultaneously. Immediately, their faces flooded with shock at her words. "What's wrong, Debbie?" Having lost his patience, Jared called her directly. Soon, Christina found a new post in her moments on WeChat. "The whole world has abandoned me. Debbie, what's happened? Some bodyguards took us to a big dinner tonight. The meal was fantastic, but they took away all of our phones, which was weird. We have just gotten our phones back and received your messages. Why did you say that? What's wrong?" Jared poured out in a flow as soon as the call was answered. Invited to a dinner by some bodyguards? And it happened just when she was left at the cemetery? The dinner ended just when she got back home? It must be the work of that evil Carlos Huo, Debbie suspected. "Oh, I'm fine and just going to sleep. How are you guys?" "We're fine too. We've been wondering who invited us to that dinner. We thought of calling you to join us, but we didn't have our phones, you know," Jared joked. Debbie's friends wouldn't have dragged her into the dinner recklessly, without knowing who those bodyguards worked for. It puzzled them immensely why someone would anonymously invite them to a dinner out of the blue and force them to eat. Finding herself in no mood to talk, Debbie looked out the window. After a flash of lightning caught her surprise, she got out of bed and drew the curtains. "Go back to the dorm quickly. I think it's going to rain soon," she said to Jared. "Okay, see you tomorrow. Good night." At 1 a.m. there was a heavy downpour. The sound of emptiness was disrupted by the loud, gregarious boom of thunder which lit up the entire room. Debbie clutched the covers tightly. Generally, she wasn't scared as long as the lights were on. But tonight, her visit to the Martyrs Park had frightened the life out of her. Lying in bed, she turned and rolled, afraid to close her eyes. Feeling restless, she took her phone from the night table and started to read the updates on Weibo. Outside, the rain was getting heavier. A jagged bolt of white-hot lightning split the chilly sky, and within seconds, the rolling boom of the thunder reverberated overhead. As if things weren't bad enough, an introduction of a horror novel popped up on her screen. The book was about the wedding of the dead. The pictures of a coffin and a dead bride in a wedding gown, along with the introduction, was crippling horrifying. Debbie was so shaken up, she could barely suppress her scream. She sat up immediately and looked around her bedroom. A few deep breaths steadied her rapid heartbeats. Only did she remember that Carlos was in the next room. At this late hour, he must be sleeping. Here, she was losing her mind, trembling in fear, while he was sound asleep in the next room. Life could be so unfair sometimes. He wishes. Debbie clutched a pillow tightly and got out of bed. Quiet as a deer, she opened the door. It was pitch black in the hallways, so she retracted her steps to the night table and got her phone. With the phone light switched on, she sneaked towards Carlos' bedroom and turned the doorknob to get inside. A sudden flash of lightning lit up the dark room for a second, and Debbie caught sight of the man sleeping in bed. Her feet tiptoed on the thick carpet, and she walked up to his bed silently. 3, 2, 1. She got there. Before she was able to celebrate, she was shoved face down onto the bed. With her hands pressed against her back, she tried her best to turn her head. Finally, she managed to squeeze out a few words through her gritted teeth. "It's me, Debbie. Let go of me, Carlos." Carlos shook his head to sober himself up and then released her hands. "What are you doing in my room at this hour of the night?" If he had a gun, he would have pointed it at her head. Debbie heaved a sigh of relief when she was released. "Oh my God, is he always so jumpy even when he's asleep? I wanted to check if you were asleep." She made an excuse, turned over to lie down, and looked at the man who was now sitting on the bed. "I was asleep," he said impatiently. "Go back to sleep." Debbie closed her eyes and lay still. Carlos looked at her in confusion. Shouldn't she get off the bed and leave my room? Why is she still lying here? "Well, are you implying that you want to sleep with me?" His straightforward words made her cheeks blush red with shame. She immediately covered her chest with her hands and argued, "Don't talk nonsense. I thought you'd be afraid to sleep on your own, so I came here to keep you company." Debbie was too proud to admit that she was the one who was afraid of sleeping alone. Carlos was amused by her lame excuse. "I'm afraid to sleep on my own? Are you kidding me? Why can't you just admit that you want my company?" "I'm not afraid of sleeping alone. I'm only afraid of being raped by you," he teased. "Hey, watch your tongue. Don't flatter yourself. I'm not interested in you at all. I'm just sleepy. I need to sleep now." Just after she said that, she sat up straight. Carlos thought she was leaving, but actually she lay back and tucked herself in. Baffled, he demanded, "Out." He wasn't used to sleeping with another person in the same bed. "No, I must accompany you." Debbie was resilient. He rubbed his arching brows and explained, "I'm not used to sleeping with others. You're lying. I know it. You just don't want to hurt Miss Me's heart." "Miss Me? Who's she?" he thought to himself. After pausing to think for a moment, Carlos finally realized that she was referring to Olga. "She has nothing to do with this," he snapped. "Is she not your girlfriend?" Debbie scratched her head curiously. After all, she had seen Carlos and Olga together a couple of times. "I'm a married man. I'm not interested in having a mistress, he answered. Debbie snickered with pleasure as she sat up again and approached him. You didn't even blush after lying. Last time in Shining International Plaza, you bought her so many things. Now you are telling me that you are not interested in her. Boss, are you giving yourself a slap in the face? Should a man not pay the bill when he is shopping with a woman? Yes, I bought her many things. It didn't mean that she is my mistress. Carlos shook his head in disbelief. What the hell was she thinking? His words do make sense. Besides, he is Carlos Huo, the richest man in Y City. It's not unusual for him to pay millions of dollars for women, Debbie mused. All right then. Good night. This time, she pulled the quilt over her head. She was so sleepy she could hardly keep her eyelids from shutting. In less than a minute, the man slid under the quilt and pressed himself against her. As if he was expecting her to scream, he pressed her lips with his. On top of her, he pinned her hands to the bed. His lips were firm, demanding, and his fingertips were on fire running over her soft skin. Her eyes widened as she wasn't expecting things to turn out this way. I'm here to sleep, not sleep with you. Yes, we are a couple, but only in name. I never wanted to be married to you. I certainly did not plan on having sex with you, she thought inwardly. His wet lips glided to her ear. She shivered and came back to her senses. She grabbed his hand and stopped him from caressing her breasts. Carlos, I'm not here to sleep with you. Don't get me wrong, she gasped. Carlos paused to look at her and said, It's too late. His loins were burning and he needed to put out the fire. He began to plant feather-like kisses across her cheeks, her chin, and on the corners of her mouth. Fear flooded her system and she pleaded, Please, please don't. It's all my fault. I was afraid of sleeping alone, so I came here. Carlos looked at the woman doubtfully and asked, What were you afraid of? You were not in the cemetery anymore. Debbie gave him an embarrassed smile and explained, It has been thundering like crazy. I'm usually not afraid of it, but ever since you left me alone in that cemetery, I haven't been able to sleep on my own. She finally acknowledged the truth and heaved a sigh of relief. She believed that he should be held responsible for the whole thing. Carlos sighed and shook his head in disappointment. I shouldn't have punished her like that. I thought she was afraid of nothing, but turns out she is just a girl. Damn it, I made my bed, and now I must lie on it. He let go of her and lay beside her quietly to calm himself down. Debbie felt relieved when Carlos let her go. Oh, shame on me. I'm always pretending to be fearless in front of others. But whenever Carlos comes into the picture, I'm not the same person anymore. What is wrong with me? She buried herself in her thoughts. After several minutes, when Carlos finally calmed himself down, he opened his mouth to say something, but soon realized that his wife was sound asleep. The next day, in the economics and management school, one of the multimedia classrooms was overflowing with students. There were still more students outside the door trying to come in. The boys looked at the girls enviously. The girls entered the classroom one after another, while the boys were stopped by Debbie and Jared. Some boys couldn't keep silent anymore. Debbie, Nian, why won't you allow us to attend Mr. Huo's class? We want to get in as well. The classroom door was being guarded by Debbie and Jared. With her back leaning against the wall, she crossed her arms and said indifferently, There are too many students who want to take Mr. Huo's class. We're here to maintain public order. You are boys. Can't you be generous enough to let these adorable girls take his class? A girl who was about to enter overheard their conversation and turned around. She cast a scornful glance at the boys and said, Exactly, be a gentleman, okay? All the boys were rendered speechless. Jared flung his arm around a boy's shoulder and announced in a loud voice, Guys, what a lovely, sunny day. I'd like to treat you guys to a game of golf this morning, and we can grab lunch right after." Very few people were able to resist temptations of such degree. Moreover, even fewer people were brave enough to turn Jared down. As a result, Carlos was caught by surprise when he entered the classroom. The classroom smelled strongly of women's perfume, and there were almost 1,000 girls present. Carlos was the only man in the classroom. Baffled, he put his stuff on the desk and swept his eyes over the crowd. When his eyes caught sight of a girl who was wearing a proud smile, he immediately realized what was going on. Instantly, he figured out that this was all a part of Debbie's revenge. Without further ado, he turned on the projector and started the class. "Good morning, everyone. Class begins now. What I'm going to talk about today is the current situation of financial technology industry. No wonder countless girls fawned over Carlos. Watching the handsome man carry out his work in a diligent manner rendered the girls breathless and made their hearts skip a beat. Unravel the unknown. Unleash the unimaginable." Once Debbie stood in the corner, Carlos asked another student to answer his question. A short giggle escaped Debbie's mouth when she saw that his next target was her friend, the second from the left in the 8th row. "Stand up and tell us what you've learned so far." The unfortunate soul was Casey. "If she can answer the question, I'll walk backwards the whole day," Debbie swore to herself. Fortunately for Debbie, she didn't need to do that. Casey was far from being considered an exemplary student. In fact, she was one of those students who had been enrolled through the back door. Having failed in answering Carlos' question, she was asked to stand next to Debbie. Debbie felt much better now as she had her good friend's company. Much to their surprise, soon their another close friend, Christina, also joined them on the platform. Contrary to her two friends before her, Christina actually answered the question, but since she failed to stress the essentials, she failed to please Carlos. The three girls were embarrassed to find themselves being put up as an example for the rest of the class. But when they saw each other in the same awkward situation, they couldn't help giggling. As for the remainder of the class, most of the girls pretended to be inattentive in hopes of being questioned by Carlos so that they could stand on the platform as well. They thought that Debbie and her two friends were lucky to be standing so close to him. Unfortunately, Carlos didn't ask anyone to answer his questions after that. He was giving lectures with the help of slides he had prepared at home, which he displayed on the big screen for everyone to see. During his lecture, he stood in front of Debbie with his back to her. They were so close to each other that she could practically count his hair. "An idle mind was the devil's workshop," was an old saying befitting Debbie's current state. Bored to tears, she grabbed Casey's hand while counting Carlos' hair. "Debbie Nian, could you please repeat what I've just said?" His cold voice successfully brought her back to her senses. "What? Not again!" she cursed in her mind. "You said, I," she stammered, not knowing what to say, and regretting not having listened to him when she had the chance. Casey, who had been attracted by Carlos' handsome face, failed to answer the question like Debbie had. Christina, however, gave the correct answer this time. Carlos was indeed a good teacher who knew how to explain complicated theories in a more simple manner. As long as Christina paid attention to what he was saying, she immediately understood what he was teaching. Carlos put his book down on the desk and said, "Good job, Christina Lin. You may go back to your seat now. Casey Zhang and Debbie Nian, I want to see the both of you in my office after the class. This is a very important topic for your final exams. I'll try and discuss it with you two alone until you can full grasp the concepts." The rest of the students were shocked by what Carlos had said. B. Mr. Huo will teach them alone? How they wished they could have the opportunity to spend some time with him alone. Dive into stories, embrace enchantment. 90% of the girls were envious of Debbie and Casey because they also wanted to spend time alone with Carlos. As for the rest, they were straight-A students and wanted to be instructed by him because he was a really good teacher. What happened next was beyond Casey's imagination. Excited, she held Debbie's arm and entered Carlos' office, but was dismissed by him immediately. Casey Zhang, you've listened to me carefully, so there's no need for you to stay here. You may take your leave now, Carlos said with a friendly smile. Still in a trance, Casey nodded and said, Okay. She turned around and left the office obediently, as if she were hypnotized by him. Soon after, the sound of the closing door coming from behind her brought her back to her senses. But I didn't listen to a single thing he said in class. What's more, Debbie's still in there. At this moment, Tristan, Carlos' assistant, walked up to Casey. Pushing up his glasses, he smiled. If you don't have anything else to report, you may go back to class now. But Debbie is still in there, she answered anxiously. I believe it will be good for your friend to be taught by Mr. Huo alone. Tristan was simply implying that Carlos wouldn't be too happy if Casey knocked on his office door now. Casey was not witless, and she understood his point immediately. Despite her fear of Carlos, her concern for her friend prevailed. Thinking about the conflicts between Debbie and Carlos, she asked, Will Mr. Huo do something to Debbie? Like the other girls in the classroom, Debbie was so deep in thought that she hadn't been paying attention while Carlos was giving a lesson. Wow, he is so handsome. His voice is so sexy and charming. He's got a perfect body. He looks like a prince. Well, I'd like to have a student sum up what I've just said, Carlos stated. Most of the girls couldn't contain their excitement. They raised their hands and waved at him to draw his attention. Everyone but Debbie was hoping that they would be the lucky one, the first from the left in the 8th row. Please stand up and tell us what you've learned so far. His attractive voice had hardly faded when the girls whipped their heads to look at the area he was pointing at. To most, the girl whose name got called was favored by fortune. When they saw who the lucky dog was, they started gossiping amongst themselves. Isn't she the girl who was guarding the door before the class started? Exactly. She is Debbie Nian from class 22. What? She is tomboy? She is so pretty. No wonder she is so popular. Meanwhile, the girl everybody was talking about was still lost in her own thoughts. She thought of the night when she slept in the same bed as Carlos, and she blushed red like a spring rose with an awkward smile on her face. After a few seconds had passed and there was still no response from Debbie, Casey, who was sitting next to her, nudged her back to her senses. What's up? Asked Debbie. Why is everyone looking at me like that? She wondered in confusion. Christina, who was sitting next to Casey, said in a light voice, Tomboy, Mr. Huo wants you to answer his question. You need to sum up what he has just said. Debbie's heart leapt into her throat. What he has said. But I wasn't following anything. Embarrassed, she stood up slowly and flipped open the book in front of her on the desk. But she was unable to utter a single word. Since you failed to answer my question, come here and stand on the platform, Carlos demanded in a calm voice. What? Stand on the platform? Despite the confusion in her mind, Debbie left her seat and stepped on the platform. Carlos, with a straight face, pointed to a corner and said, You need to stand there and listen to my lecture until the class ends. Debbie's eyes flew open as rows of heads turned to face her. The spot Carlos was pointing to was only 3 meters away from the screen. If Carlos stood on the left of the platform, they would be standing very close to each other. She would be within half a meter away from him. Debbie was mortified, frozen to the spot. Feeling embarrassed, she couldn't believe what had happened. It wasn't the first time she had been punished by a teacher. In truth, 9 out of 10 teachers would not dare to punish her even if she had done something wrong in class. And if the remaining one did dare to ask her to stand on the platform, she would just turn a deaf ear to it. Several minutes had passed, and Debbie was still standing there frozen like a statue. However, an icy glance from Carlos' eyes gave her chills. "Humph, you jerk. How dare you look at me like that? Did you forget what you did to me last night? What a two-faced buffoon!" She cursed inwardly. Soon, the horrifying memories of the time he had left her alone in the cemetery crept into her mind and gripped her with fear. Shuddering in horror, she bit her lower lip and reluctantly walked to the corner specified by her damn husband. This must be his revenge. He must be enjoying this a lot. Wow, what a petty man. Tristan was amused by Casey's question, but he tried his best to maintain a serious face. First of all, Mr. Huo is a gentleman who will not force women to do anything they don't want. Second, Debbie is his wife. It wouldn't be inappropriate if they did end up doing something. He thought to himself, "Don't worry. What Mr. Huo is doing is for Miss Nian's own good," he reassured Casey. Tristan didn't know what his boss would do to Debbie, but he knew it would do him best to stay away from their matters. Casey, however, still felt worried about her friend, for she remembered what Christina had told her before. Carlos intended to bury Debbie alive the last time. "How about I get in and stay with Debbie? I swear I'll just sit there and listen to Mr. Huo. I won't make any noise," she pleaded. Tristan shook his head and thought, "If I let you in, Mr. Huo will be angry with me. I don't want to be punished by him. I should take warning from Emmett's example." He cleared his throat and said, "Miss Zhang, I assure you that Mr. Huo won't do anything to Miss Nian. Would you please stop worrying about your friend?" Casey had no choice but to leave because she realized that Tristan would not let her pass by any means. As she walked to the classroom, she couldn't stop getting worked up about Debbie. In Carlos' office, Carlos placed a folder on the desk in front of Debbie and said, "For the rest of this semester, you will need to take these classes: yoga, dancing, piano, etiquette. You also need to take part in the postgraduate entrance exams. So I will be your teacher for English, advanced mathematics, and financial economy." Stop, Debbie interrupted, as her eyes widened at the sight of the countless classes listed. She leaned forward to get close to him and said, "Old man, who gave you the right to arrange so many classes for me? Did you ever ask for my opinion? Did I ever give you my consent?" She cursed in her mind. Old man? Am I really that old to her? Carlos knitted his eyebrows and answered in a low voice, "I'm your husband." His voice was so captivating and attractive that Debbie got caught in a trance. It took her a while before she came back to her senses. Feigning a calm disposition, she cleared her throat and retorted, "Yes, I'm not denying that. You are just my husband. But what you've done to me only makes me wonder if you're treating me like I'm your daughter." Carlos' face soured when he heard what she had said. As hurtful as they were, there was truth in her harsh words. All of a sudden, he reached out to pull her into his arms and forced her to sit on his lap. Dive into stories, embrace enchantment. Despite her struggling, he held her waist tightly with his left arm and grabbed her chin with his right hand to make her look him in the eye. "Ah, I see. You want me to do something that only your husband is allowed to do. No problem." Before Debbie knew it, he lowered his head and kissed her red lips. Her eyes widened as she wasn't expecting things to turn out this way. "I didn't mean it that way. I was just trying to ask him not to discipline me like my father did. Is he taking advantage of me now?" However, she couldn't deny the fact that Carlos was an amazing kisser. All the sensations he was bringing her made her close her eyes and savor the entire moment. It was not until she was pressed against the desk and the two buttons of her shirt were unbuttoned that she came back to her senses. She grabbed his hand, her breath coming in short gasps, and her cheeks were bright red.
"Carlos, no."
"Please." How bold he was. This was the teacher's office. Was he just trying to have her here? Having realized her unwillingness, he stopped at just 2 buttons. He leaned his forehead against hers and breathed heavily. After a short time, he calmed down and said in a husky voice, "I can let you go, but remember, no more martial arts classes. You need to choose 2 from yoga, dancing, piano, and etiquette, and I'll teach you the other courses in the evenings." Debbie bit her lower lip, reluctant to obey his orders. "I have one condition," she said, trying to bargain. Carlos wanted to turn her down, but on second thought he decided against it. After all, he didn't want his wife to think of him as her father. He took a deep breath and briefly said, "Name it. I will only choose yoga. English, advanced mathematics, and so on." Those lessons meant torture to her. Carlos released her and became aloof again, as if the part of him who had been aroused just moments ago had left his body. Debbie was shocked by his behavior. "He acts as if it were not him who kissed me and wanted to strip off my clothes. What a fake man. Want to watch a movie?" he offered. "What?" Debbie was amazed by his kind offer. With a malicious smile, he said, "A horror movie is showing in the cinemas. Come with me." The mention of a horror movie alone was enough to make Debbie turn pale. She cursed him in her mind for knowing her weaknesses. Eventually, she agreed to his proposal. She would take yoga and dancing classes twice a week respectively, and he would hire professional teachers for her. Carlos himself would be responsible for her English and advanced mathematics results. On her way back to the classroom, Debbie was fuming mad at the man and also despised herself. "Why do I always give in to his whims? He seems to know all of my weaknesses. Did he have his men investigate me? What a wicked man. He's not ashamed to threaten me with my weak points." When she was deep in thought, the sound of an incoming message brought her back to her senses. She took out her phone and found that someone with the nickname C had sent her a friend request on WeChat. Debbie didn't give it much importance as she thought that the person might be one of her classmates, so she accepted it as a friend. Before long, she opened her WeChat moments and shared something. "He is a wolf in sheep's clothing." Casey, who was playing on her phone, immediately saw it and called Debbie. "Did Mr. Huo let you go? So soon? And what does your post mean? Did he do something to you?" Debbie raised her head and stared at the ceiling. After a short pause, she cursed through gritted teeth. "Casey, I must have done something very bad to him in my past life. That's why he is taking revenge on me." Thinking of her miserable life in the future, she couldn't help but say some bad words in her mind. What do you mean? Did Mr. Huo?" Casey didn't finish her sentence, but her dirty laugh was telling Debbie what she was asking. Obviously, Casey was expecting a positive answer from Debbie. Debbie didn't intend to keep it a secret from her friend. "He kissed me. Can you believe it? Is he not a teacher? How could he kiss a student in his office? Do you agree that he's a beast in sheep's clothing?" A loud scream came from the other end of the line, and Debbie had to move her phone away from her ear. She cast a scornful glance at her phone as if she were looking at Casey in person. "Debbie, Mr. Huo must have a thing for you. What are you waiting for? Go to him and make him your man," Casey yelled. "What the fuck? Are you kidding me?" Debbie was shocked by her friend's suggestion. She snapped back, "Casey Zheng, are you my friend or not? Since when did you become my pimp? How dare you ask me to go to him and—" Debbie was too shy to utter the words, "Make him my man." Why did Casey give in to Carlos' handsome face so easily? Debbie couldn't believe what her friend had just told her. "Come on. If I weren't your friend, I would have gone to him myself. He is Mr. Huo. Do you know what that means? If you become his woman, do you know how many women will be jealous of you? Tomboy, you'll be a real-life winner." Debbie was rendered speechless. On the other hand, Carlos was really efficient and reliable. The next morning, the dance teacher arrived at the East City Villa by 8 a.m. As Debbie's first class in the university started at 10:30 a.m., she was still sound asleep when the teacher arrived. Julie came to Debbie's bedroom and gently woke her up. When Debbie squinted her sleepy eyes at her, Julie told her that the dance teacher was waiting for her in the dance room. After readying herself, Debbie entered the dance room. The moment she saw the dance teacher, her eyes lit up and she became enthusiastic about taking lessons. The teacher was about Debbie's age. She had a pretty face and, most importantly, a perfect figure. Debbie could tell from the way she dressed that she was a soft and gentle girl. Debbie was almost drooling over her, firmly under the impression that most men would fall for her at first sight. The dance teacher walked up to Debbie elegantly with a friendly smile on her face and said, "Good morning. You must be Debbie." Debbie smiled back and nodded. "Good morning." They shook hands and made a good first impression on each other. The dance teacher introduced herself. "I'm Teresa Sue, and you may just call me Teresa, although I have just graduated from university. I've been learning how to dance for almost 20 years and teaching others for almost 4 years now." "Wow, Teresa, your parents must be a fan of Teresa Ting, huh?" Debbie's curiosity was piqued. A smile appeared on Teresa Sue's lips and she answered, "Yes, you're right. My mother is a Chinese teacher and my father is a professor of Chinese literature. They are both Teresa Tang's loyal fans." Apparently, she was very proud of her parents. After making small talk, they began the class. Teresa Sue was indeed a soft girl, and even Debbie, who had always been a tomboy, became softer while she was with the dance teacher. Since Debbie had been practicing martial arts for more than 10 years, it wasn't long before she had mastered the basic skills of dancing. The class lasted for almost an hour and a half, but Debbie was not tired at all. When the class came to an end, Teresa Sue changed her clothes and walked towards the gates of the villa, followed by Debbie. "I had a great time, Teresa," said Debbie. "I appreciate it. See you next time, Debbie." Teresa Sue waved her goodbye. "Bye, Teresa." After Teresa Sue left the villa, Debbie went back to the living room and threw herself on the couch. She needed to go to the university soon. There was no way she was going to risk missing Carlos' class in the afternoon. How she wished she could just play truant like she had done before. She was both physically and mentally exhausted because of him. "I assume time was money for the likes of Carlos. I've heard that he makes around hundreds of millions of dollars in just 1 minute. I wonder why he chose to waste time on our school. I really don't understand it," Debbie thought to herself. In the afternoon, Debbie went to a Haagen-Dazs shop and bought 2 scoops of ice cream. With her books in one hand and the ice cream in the other, she made her way to the classroom. It was Carlos' class and she didn't dare to cut it. Otherwise, the man would come up with a plethora of ways to punish her. Lost in various fancies and conjectures, she walked slowly across the maple grove of the university, not realizing that the bell for her class had already rung. Between her and the building where she was supposed to attend her class was a massive playground. She decided to walk across the playground to avoid taking an indirect route. Suddenly, her phone beeped in her pocket. She got hold of the ice cream cup with her mouth and took out her phone to read the WeChat message sent by Jared. "Tomboy, where are you? You're already 3 minutes late for Carlos Huo's class." The number of exclamation marks indicated how anxious he was. It was not until then that she realized she was late for class. She put her phone back in her pocket, grabbed her ice cream, and was about to run towards the classroom. However, on second thought, she was already late. 3 minutes late or 10 minutes would make very little difference. She held the ice cream cup between her teeth again and replied to Jared's WeChat message. "I'm on my way to the classroom. I'll be right there." She clicked the send button. "Debbie Nian, does that ice cream taste good?" The familiar voice was so cold that Debbie almost choked on her ice cream. Is this man a ghost? Why is he everywhere? I thought he was in the classroom. Why is he here? On the playground. Debbie bit her lower lip in frustration. She put her phone back, took the ice cream, and raised her head. To her surprise, not only was Carlos standing there, but all her classmates were standing in perfect order in the middle of the playground. Since when did this class get switched to military training class? The ice cream tastes good. Huh? Carlos repeated. Confused, Debbie just nodded without saying a word. Of course it tastes good. It cost me $80 asterisk, she thought to herself. Asterisk TN. In this novel, a scoop of Haagen-Dazs ice cream costs $40. The students snickered at Debbie's response and wondered since when she had become so silly. Poker-faced, Carlos pointed to a place under a big tree and said, "Go there and finish your ice cream." In compliance with his order, Debbie walked towards the tree and began to enjoy her ice cream in the shade. From a close distance, she observed Carlos, who was helping her classmates adjust their standing postures. He was showing them the standard military posture. From where Debbie was standing, he looked like a natural. So much that Debbie wondered whether he had served in the army before. After happily eating the ice cream, Debbie threw the cup into the trash bin when she heard Carlos calling her name. "Debbie Nian, since the ice cream tastes so good, why don't you buy everyone 2 scoops of ice cream?" "What?" Debbie's eyes and mouth were frozen wide open in an expression of stunned surprise. Before she could finish her sentence, Carlos added, "If you disagree, you and all your classmates will have to run 20 laps around the track."
20 laps.
Carlos' words caused not only Debbie, but all of her classmates to break into wild uproar. It was a 400-meter track, and 20 laps meant that they needed to run 8 kilometers. That was unbelievable. They all turned to Debbie and began to persuade her. "Debbie, I know you are good at long-distance running. You even won 3rd prize in the half marathon. But we are not. Debbie, you wouldn't do this to us, right? Debbie, why don't you just go and buy us ice cream? You are from a wealthy family, aren't you? You ride a BMW to school every day, don't you? If you don't buy us ice cream, everyone will call you a penny pincher." Debbie was at a loss for words. If she didn't buy the ice cream for her classmates, they would have to run 8 kilometers. The last thing she wanted was to earn everyone's resentment. However, the price of a scoop of ice cream cost $40. 2 scoops meant $80. There were about 100 students on the playground now, and this meant she would have to pay $8,000 if she didn't want her classmates to run 8 kilometers with her. What the hell? I hate you, Carlos Huo. She was so angry she could strangle him then and there. Debbie cast a burning, reproachful glance at the man, cleared her throat, and turned to her classmates. "Hey, are you guys willing to run around the track with me?" Last time, she had spent almost all her savings on the sapphire collar pin for Carlos as a peace offering. She barely had any money left on her. Running 8 kilometers was a piece of cake for her and her friend Dixon. They had both finished the half marathon last time. But this was a different story for the others. They all united as one and collectively answered in a singular voice, "No!" Debbie was rendered speechless. Tristan, who was standing not too far away, witnessed the whole incident as it unfolded before his eyes. He could barely keep the smile off of his face as he watched Debbie's reluctant expression. What a silly girl. She thinks that she was made to stand there alone and buy all her classmates ice cream as punishment, when in fact she was enjoying her ice cream in the shade of the tree while the others were standing in the sun during class. Besides, the money she would use to buy her classmates the ice cream is from Mr. Huo. However, Debbie wasn't aware of that fact yet. Since she had been living on her own in the past 3 years, she didn't realize that she was using Carlos' money. After paying the bill with her credit card, Debbie felt like someone had squeezed the life out of her. Several salesgirls followed her to the university, attracting the attention of many passers-by. All the while, she wasn't sure whether to cry or to laugh. Why was Carlos such a ruthless man? Debbie sat under the big tree watching her classmates as they happily stuffed their mouths with ice cream. Some of them were very excited as they had never tasted such expensive ice cream before. Strangely, many girls surrounded Carlos to express their thanks to him. "Hey, I was the one who bought the ice cream. Why are you thanking him instead of me? It would make sense if they knew that he is the one supporting me financially. But they don't know that. Wait, am I stupid or what? I didn't realize that I was using his money," Debbie thought to herself. As soon as she came to that realization, she jumped to her feet and ran towards Carlos. "Get out of the way." She pushed several girls aside and stood in front of him.